David, a humble shepherd boy, became one of the greatest kings in biblical history. But his journey was filled with extraordinary triumphs and devastating failures that make his story universally relatable even thousands of years later. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, I'll guide you through the complete arc of King David's remarkable life. From his unlikely victory over Goliath to his passionate psalms, his forbidden love for Bathsheba, his complex legacy as Israel's most beloved king, and ultimately the ancestor of Jesus Christ. But before we dive in, if you're new to the channel, don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button for more content like this. Also, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is. So, without further ado, let's begin, shall we? Nash Prologue, The Threads of Destiny. Long ago, in a land of hills and valleys where morning dew clung to olive branches and evening stars watched over sleeping flocks, there lived a people chosen for a special purpose. This ancient land of Israel, nestled between mighty empires and crossed by dusty caravan routes, held the story of a shepherd boy who would become king. Before our tale begins, Israel had no kings. For generations after settling in the Promised Land, the people were guided by judges, wise men and women raised up in times of need. These judges weren't rulers in the way we think of kings and queens. They settled disputes, led armies when enemies threatened, and reminded the people of their covenant with God. This was a simpler time, when each family tended their own plot of land, harvested their own grain, and pressed their own olive oil. Villages nestled on hillsides were bound together by kinship and faith, celebrating festivals that marked the turning of seasons and remembered their journey from slavery to freedom. But the world was changing around them. Egypt to the south and Mesopotamia to the east had powerful kings. Closer still, the seafaring Philistines built cities along the coast with iron weapons and organized armies. The Canaanites, Moabites, and Ammonites all had kings to lead them, while Israel followed the rhythm of a different drum. As evening shadows grew longer across the hills of Judah, an old order was fading. The time of judges was drawing to a close, and the threads of countless lives were being woven together into a tapestry none could fully see. Among these threads, one would shine with particular brightness, the life of a boy named David. In those days, hearts grew restless. "Give us a king," the people began to murmur, like all the other nations have. They longed for someone to lead them into battle, to stand before them as a symbol of unity and strength. This desire would set in motion events that would change their world forever. Our story is one of faith tested in life's valleys and strengthened on its mountaintops. It tells of power gained and power misused, of betrayal's bitter taste and redemption's sweet mercy. Through it all runs a golden thread, the presence of something greater than human strength or wisdom. As stars appear in the evening sky, imagine yourself there, smelling the wild thyme crushed underfoot, hearing distant sheep bells as flocks settle for the night, feeling the cooling breeze after a warm day. This is where our story begins, in the quiet moments between day and night, between one age and another. Listen now to the tale of David, shepherd boy, musician warrior, fugitive, king, sinner, and psalmist. His life, with all its light and shadow, reveals truths that echo through time about what it means to be truly human, truly flawed and truly loved despite it all. Let these ancient words carry you like a gentle stream, flowing from long ago yet speaking still to hearts that listen. As you drift with this timeless story, may you find rest in its familiar rhythms and peace in its enduring hope. The Last Judge. The Rise of Samuel. In the hill country of Ephraim lived a man named Elkanah with his two wives, Peninnah and Hannah. While Peninnah had children, Hannah remained childless, her heart heavy with longing. Each year, the family would journey to Shiloh to worship at the sanctuary where the Ark of the Covenant rested. Hannah's prayers rose like evening incense, whispered so fervently that Eli the priest thought she was drunk. With lips moving but voice silent, she made a vow. "Lord, if you give me a son, I will give him back to you for all the days of his life." Eli, understanding at last, blessed her. "Go in peace, and may God grant what you have asked." In time, Hannah cradled a son in her arms. She named him Samuel, which means heard by God. True to her promise, when the boy was weaned, she brought him to Shiloh. "For this child I prayed," she told Eli, "and now I give him to the Lord for as long as he lives." Young Samuel grew up in the sanctuary's shadow, helping Eli with sacred duties. The boy slept near the ark, tending the lamps that shouldn't go out before morning. One night, as stars wheeled overhead and oil lamps burned low, Samuel heard a voice calling his name. Thinking Eli needed him, the boy hurried to the old priest's side. "Here I am, for you called me," Samuel said. Eli, roused from sleep, sent him back to bed. 3 times this happened, until Eli realized who was calling. "Go and lie down," he told Samuel. "If he calls again, say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" When the voice came again, Samuel answered as instructed. That night, God revealed to the boy what would happen to Eli's family because his sons had dishonored the sacred offerings. Morning came, and Samuel, afraid to tell Eli what he had heard, went about his duties until the priest insisted on hearing everything. As Samuel grew older, his words proved trustworthy. From Dan in the north to Beersheba in the south, people recognized him as a prophet whose messages came true. While neighboring peoples worshipped gods of wood and stone, Samuel reminded Israel of their covenant with the living God who had brought them out of Egypt. These were troubled times. The Philistines pressed in from coastal cities with chariots and organized armies. In one devastating battle, the Ark of the Covenant was captured, and Eli's sons were killed. When news reached the elderly priest, he fell backward from his seat, broke his neck, and died. For 20 years, Samuel guided Israel through this dark period. He traveled a circuit between Bethel, Gilgal, and Mizpah, settling disputes and teaching God's ways. Under his leadership, the people turned away from foreign gods and recommitted themselves to the covenant. When the Philistines gathered for another attack, Samuel offered sacrifices and prayed for protection. As battle joined, thunder rolled across the sky, throwing the enemy into such confusion that Israel won a decisive victory. Samuel set up a stone memorial named Ebenezer, saying, "Thus far has the Lord helped us." Peace settled over the land during Samuel's lifetime. Yet as his hair grew white and his steps slower, trouble brewed again. Not from outside enemies, but from within. Samuel appointed his sons, Joel and Abijah, as judges in Beersheba. Unlike their father, they accepted bribes and twisted justice for personal gain. The elders of Israel gathered at Ramah, where Samuel lived. Their request fell heavy on the aging prophet's ears. "You are old, and your sons do not follow your ways. Now appoint a king to lead us, such as all the other nations have." Samuel was deeply troubled. Israel was meant to be different, with God as their true king. He prayed for guidance, his weathered hands raised in the gathering dusk. The answer came clear as stars appearing in the evening sky. "Listen to all that the people are saying to you. They have not rejected you, but they have rejected me as their king." Morning light found Samuel addressing the elders again. He warned them what having a king would mean: sons taken for the army, daughters for the palace, fields and vineyards claimed for royal favorites, taxes that would feel like bondage. Still, the people insisted, "We want a king to lead us and fight our battles." As shadows lengthened across the hills of Israel, an era was ending. The time of judges, those raised up for specific needs, was giving way to something new. Samuel, the bridge between these ages, would anoint Israel's first king, even as his heart held on to the vision of what might have been. Israel's first king, Saul's anointing. In the territory of Benjamin lived a man named Kish, wealthy and respected among his tribe. His son Saul stood head and shoulders above other men, handsome, strong, and imposing. Yet destiny found him on a humble errand, searching for his father's lost donkeys. After 3 days of fruitless searching, Saul and his servant approached the town where Samuel was staying. "Let's ask the seer," suggested the servant, offering the last quarter shekel of silver as payment for the prophet's help. As they climbed toward the town gate, they met women coming to draw water, who directed them to the high place where Samuel would bless the sacrifice. What Saul didn't know was that the day before, God had whispered to Samuel, "About this time tomorrow, I will send you a man from Benjamin. Anoint him leader over my people Israel." Now, seeing the tall young man approaching, Samuel heard the inner voice again. This is the one. Before Saul could even ask about missing donkeys, Samuel invited him to eat in the place of honor at the feast, where a special portion had been set aside as if expecting him. Confused but pleased, Saul accepted. "Am I not a Benjamite from the smallest tribe? Why such honor?" he wondered. As evening fell, they talked on the rooftop under a canopy of stars. What passed between them, the scriptures don't say, but morning found Samuel walking Saul to the edge of town. Sending the servant ahead, Samuel took a flask of olive oil and poured it over Saul's head. "The Lord has anointed you ruler over his inheritance," he declared. To confirm this unexpected calling, Samuel gave Saul 3 signs that would happen on his journey home: an encounter near Rachel's tomb, an offer of bread at the great tree of Tabor, and a group of prophets coming down from the high place. "The Spirit of the Lord will come powerfully upon you," Samuel said. "You will prophesy and be changed into a different person." Everything happened just as Samuel predicted. When Saul met the prophets, the Spirit came upon him, and he began to prophesy with them. People who knew him were astonished. "Is Saul also among the prophets?" The question became a saying in Israel. Samuel called the people to Mizpah to present their new king. Using the sacred lots, he narrowed down tribe by tribe, clan by clan, until Saul was selected. But when they looked for him, Saul was nowhere to be found. He had hidden himself among the baggage, perhaps overwhelmed by the weight of what was happening. Once found and brought forward, Saul's impressive height caused many to shout, "Long live the king!" Samuel explained the rights and duties of kingship, writing them on a scroll placed before the ark. Yet not everyone celebrated. Some troublemakers muttered, "How can this man save us?" Saul, showing wisdom beyond his years, held his peace. The new king's first test came quickly. Nahash the Ammonite besieged Jabesh Gilead, offering surrender terms that included gouging out the right eye of every man. When messengers brought this news to Gibeah, Saul was returning from the fields behind his oxen, still living as a farmer despite his anointing. Hearing the people's distress, the Spirit of God came powerfully upon Saul. He cut a pair of oxen into pieces and sent them throughout Israel with this warning: "This is what will be done to the oxen of anyone who does not follow Saul and Samuel." Fear of the Lord fell on the people, and they turned out as one. Gathering a massive force, Saul divided them into 3 groups and attacked the Ammonite camp before dawn. By midday, the enemy was scattered so completely that no 2 soldiers remained together. This decisive victory silenced those who had doubted Saul's ability to lead. At Gilgal, amid celebration and sacrifice, Samuel formally installed Saul as king. "Now here is the king you have chosen," Samuel told the people. To demonstrate that this change came with heaven's approval, Samuel called on God to send thunder and rain during the dry harvest season. When dark clouds gathered and rain poured down, the people trembled, realizing the significance of what they had done. "Do not be afraid," Samuel assured them. "Serve the Lord faithfully with all your heart. Do not turn away to worthless idols that cannot rescue you. For the sake of his great name, the Lord will not reject his people." So began the reign of Saul, son of Kish, Israel's first king. The simple man who had searched for lost donkeys now led a nation. Early success and the Spirit's power marked these beginning days, like sunrise promising a bright day ahead. Yet shadows lurked beyond the horizon, unseen but approaching. The fall of Saul, disobedience, and rejection. For 2 years, Saul ruled Israel with strength and purpose. The Philistine threat remained constant along the western borders, their outposts dotting the highlands. Iron weapons gave them advantage, and they controlled the trade routes, forbidding blacksmiths among the Hebrews lest they forge weapons of war. Saul built a standing army with his son Jonathan as a chief commander. Brave and true-hearted, Jonathan attacked a Philistine outpost at Geba, stirring the hornet's nest. In response, the Philistines gathered a massive force, 3,000 chariots, 6,000 charioteers, and foot soldiers, as numerous as the sand on the seashore. Fear gripped the Israelites. Many hid in caves and thickets, some fled across the Jordan River. Those who remained with Saul at Gilgal trembled as they waited for Samuel to arrive and offer sacrifices before battle. 7 days passed, the appointed time, but Samuel hadn't come. Watching his army dwindle as men slipped away, Saul made a fateful choice. Though not a priest, he offered the burnt offering himself. Just as the flames consumed the sacrifice, Samuel arrived, his face clouded with disappointment. "What have you done?" the prophet asked. Saul explained his reasoning: the army scattering, the Philistines gathering at Michmash, the fear that battle would begin before seeking God's favor. His words made earthly sense, but missed a deeper truth. Samuel's response fell like stones. "You have acted foolishly. You have not kept the command the Lord your God gave you. The Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel for all time, but now your kingdom will not endure." Despite this rebuke, God granted victory through Jonathan's courage and faith. With just his armor-bearer, the young prince climbed the cliffs to a Philistine outpost, saying, "Nothing can hinder the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few." 20 enemy soldiers fell before them, creating panic in the Philistine camp that spread like wildfire. Seeing the enemy in disarray, Saul led his men into battle. Israelites who had hidden now joined the fight. Victory came, but was tarnished by Saul's rash oath that no one should eat until evening. Unknowing, Jonathan tasted honey from a wild hive, bringing another crisis of Saul's making. This pattern continued through the years, victories granted despite Saul's missteps, the kingdom secured even as cracks appeared in its foundation. Saul fought against Moab, Ammon, Edom, and the kings of Zobah, pushing back Israel's enemies on every side. His family grew, sons Jonathan, Ishvi, and Malchishua, daughters Merab and Michal, his wife Ahinoam watching over their household. Then came the Amalekites, desert raiders who had attacked Israel during their wilderness journey generations before. Through Samuel, God commanded Saul to completely destroy this people and all their possessions, a harsh judgment by modern standards, yet presented as divine justice for ancient wrongs. Saul gathered his army and defeated the Amalekites from Havilah to Shur. But selective obedience proved as problematic as outright disobedience. Sparing King Agag and the best livestock, Saul returned home and erected a monument to himself at Carmel before heading to Gilgal. When Samuel arrived, Saul greeted him warmly. "The Lord bless you. I have carried out the Lord's instructions." "Then what is this bleating of sheep in my ears?" Samuel asked. "What is this lowing of cattle that I hear?" Saul explained they had saved the best animals to sacrifice to God, but Samuel cut through the excuses. Does the Lord delight in burnt offerings as much as in obedience? To obey is better than sacrifice. To heed is better than the fat of rams. In the gathering dusk, Samuel delivered the Lord's judgment. "Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king." When Saul grabbed Samuel's robe as he turned to leave, the garment tore, a visual metaphor for the kingdom being torn from Saul's grasp. Despite Saul's pleas, something had broken that couldn't easily be mended. Samuel did agree to honor Saul before the elders by worshiping together. Then, in a final act of judgment, Samuel himself executed King Agag, completing what Saul had left undone. As night fell over Ramah, Samuel returned to his home, grieving for what might have been. The text tells us, Samuel did not see Saul again until the day of his death, but Samuel mourned for Saul. The relationship between prophet and king, which had begun with such promise, ended in separation and sorrow. Meanwhile, in the palace at Gibeah, Saul continued to reign, but an unsettled spirit troubled him. The man who had once prophesied with divine inspiration now found himself abandoned by that same spirit. In its place came periods of dark depression and volatile anger, hints of the tragedy still unfolding. The kingdom remained, the battles continued, but its first king had fallen from favor. Elsewhere in Israel, unknown to Saul, wheels were already turning that would bring forth his successor, not from the palaces of power, but from the quiet pastures of Bethlehem. The shepherd boy, David's anointing. In Bethlehem, a town nestled among the Judean hills, lived a man named Jesse with his 8 sons. The family tended flocks on the surrounding slopes, where generations before, their ancestress Ruth had gleaned in the fields of Boaz. Simple and hardworking, they lived far from the royal court at Gibeah, unaware that heaven's eye had turned their way. Samuel, still mourning Saul's failure, heard the Lord's gentle rebuke. "How long will you grieve? Fill your horn with oil and go. I am sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem, for I have chosen one of his sons to be king." Fear mingled with Samuel's grief. "How can I go? If Saul hears about it, he will kill me." The king's jealousy of any threat to his throne was well known. Samuel received permission to say he had come to offer sacrifice, concealing his primary mission within a legitimate religious duty. When the prophet arrived at Bethlehem's gate, the town elders trembled. "Do you come in peace?" they asked, wondering if some sin had brought the famous prophet to their doorstep. Samuel assured them he came peacefully to offer sacrifice and invited Jesse's family to join him. As sheep bleated in nearby pens and the sacrifice was prepared, Samuel studied Jesse's sons. First came Eliab, tall and impressive, so much like Saul in appearance that Samuel thought, "Surely the Lord's anointed stands here." But the gentle voice that had guided Samuel throughout his life whispered, "Do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." One by one, 7 sons of Jesse passed before Samuel. Abinadab, then Shammah, then 4 more whose names the Bible doesn't record. To each, Samuel shook his head. Puzzled, he asked Jesse, "Are these all the sons you have?" "There is still the youngest," Jesse replied, perhaps embarrassed to have forgotten him. "He is tending the sheep." Samuel would not proceed until this last son arrived. A messenger was sent to the fields, and soon footsteps approached, not the heavy tread of a warrior, but the light step of a youth. David entered, his face weathered from outdoor life, yet still bearing the softness of adolescence. His eyes were bright and clear, his manner respectful, but not intimidated by the famous prophet. Perhaps he carried his shepherd's staff, or a small harp strapped to his back, tools of his twin callings. This youngest son had spent countless days with the sheep, protecting them from lions and bears, leading them to green pastures and still waters. During long afternoon watches, he had composed songs that rose from the hills to heaven, psalms of praise for the Creator whose handiwork surrounded him. Something in Samuel's heart leaped in recognition. This was the one. The Lord's command came clear. "Rise and anoint him. This is he." As family members watched in astonishment, Samuel took the horn of oil and poured it over David's head. The fragrant liquid ran down his hair and beard, a physical symbol of a spiritual reality. The Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David from that day on, the scriptures tell us. What thoughts raced through the young shepherd's mind as oil dripped from his chin? Did he understand what this strange anointing meant? Did visions of kingship flash before him? Or did he simply accept it as another mystery in a life already attuned to divine whispers? The text doesn't tell us what explanation Samuel offered, what words passed between them. Perhaps the full meaning was kept hidden for David's protection. To openly proclaim him as the future king would mark him for death in Saul's increasingly paranoid court. Samuel returned to Ramah, his mission completed, yet its outcome uncertain. How would this anointed shepherd boy come to the throne? When would Saul's reign end? These questions remained unanswered as he journeyed home through the hill country, the horn that had carried the anointing oil now empty at his side. David returned to his sheep in the fields of Bethlehem. Outwardly, nothing had changed. The same sun warmed his face, the same stars guided his night watches. Yet inwardly, everything was different. The spirit that had departed from Saul now rested on David, preparing him through daily faithfulness for responsibilities he could barely imagine. In the palace at Gibeah, Saul continued his troubled reign, unaware that his successor had been chosen. The king who had once hidden among the baggage now jealously guarded his throne, while the true king-to-be humbly tended sheep, learning leadership lessons that no royal court could teach. These two lives, Saul's and David's, would soon intersect in ways neither could foresee. The threads of their destinies were being woven together by hands beyond their understanding, creating a tapestry whose full pattern would only become clear with time. As evening shadows lengthened across Bethlehem's hills, David gathered his flock for the night, perhaps singing softly to calm both them and himself. "The Lord is my shepherd," he may have whispered, finding in his own care for these animals a reflection of how heaven watched over him. In the quiet hills of Bethlehem, young David tended his father's sheep with watchful eyes and a gentle heart. Days passed in peaceful rhythm as he protected the flock from wolves and bears that might threaten their safety. During these long hours under open skies, David taught himself to play the harp, filling the wilderness with melodies that seemed to flow directly from his soul. Meanwhile, in the royal palace, all was not well. King Saul, once strong and confident, found himself plagued by a troubled spirit. Dark moods descended without warning, leaving the king agitated and unable to find peace. His servants watched with growing concern as their leader became increasingly unpredictable. These episodes cast shadows over the entire court. turning what was once a place of celebration into one of whispered fears. "My lord," suggested one of Saul's trusted advisors after witnessing a particularly difficult day, "perhaps music might soothe your spirit when these troubles come upon you. Let us find someone skilled with the harp whose playing might bring you relief." Saul nodded weakly, willing to try anything that might quiet the storm within him. "Find me such a person," he commanded. Word spread throughout the kingdom that the king sought a musician. Among Saul's servants was one who had heard of Jesse's youngest son. "I know of a son of Jesse from Bethlehem," he told the king. "He plays the harp with rare gift, and beyond this, he is brave and speaks well. The Lord seems to be with him in all he does." Intrigued by this description, Saul sent messengers to Jesse with an urgent request. "Send me your son David, who tends the sheep." When Jesse received the king's command, he prepared a gift, bread, wine, and a young goat, and sent David to Saul's court. The journey from Bethlehem to Gibeah, where Saul resided, wasn't long, but for David, it marked the beginning of a path that would forever change his life. David entered the palace with quiet confidence, carrying his simple wooden harp. The contrast between the shepherd boy and the royal setting couldn't have been more striking. Yet something in his manner, perhaps the calm in his eyes or the steadiness of his step, spoke of unusual character. Saul looked up as David was presented to him, studying this youth who had been described in such glowing terms. There was nothing remarkable in his appearance, just a handsome young man with ruddy cheeks and bright eyes. But when David began to play, everything changed. His fingers moved across the strings with practiced ease, drawing forth sounds that seemed to carry healing within their notes. The music filled the chamber, washing over Saul like cool water on fevered skin. The troubled expression that had marked the king's face gradually softened and his clenched hands relaxed. Those present watched in amazement as the king's demeanor transformed. The dark spirit that had tormented him retreated before the simple beauty of David's melodies. For the first time in many days, Saul smiled. "This boy will stay," Saul declared when the music finally ceased. "I want him near whenever the darkness comes." So David entered the service of the king, standing ready to play whenever Saul's spirit was troubled. He quickly earned Saul's affection, eventually becoming his armor-bearer, a position of trust and honor. Jesse received word that his youngest son would not be returning to the sheep, but would remain in the royal court. In the palace, David observed and learned. He watched how the kingdom was governed, how soldiers trained, how diplomacy worked. Though still a youth, his mind absorbed everything around him. All the while, unknown to everyone, including David himself, the Spirit of the Lord was preparing him for a future role none could have imagined. Saul grew fond of David, finding not only relief in his music, but also enjoying his thoughtful conversation and humble manner. He sent a message to Jesse, "Allow David to remain in my service, for I am pleased with him." When the dark moods descended on Saul, David would take up his harp. As the music filled the room, those watching could see the tension leave the king's body, the troubled lines on his face smoothing away. It seemed almost magical how the simple strings could drive away what no physician or counselor could touch. What no one recognized in these quiet moments was that two futures were unfolding side by side. One king, whose reign was already marked for ending by divine decree, found temporary peace, and beside him stood the shepherd musician, already anointed in secret, whose kingdom would endure for generations to come. Goliath, the battle in the valley of Elah. The peaceful rhythm of palace life was suddenly disrupted when reports arrived of Philistine forces gathering at the border. These ancient enemies of Israel had assembled a mighty army in the valley of Elah, challenging Saul's forces to battle. King Saul, roused from his melancholy by the threat of war, gathered Israel's fighting men and marched to meet this challenge. The two armies faced each other across the valley, each occupying a mountain on either side, with the brook of Elah flowing between them. Days passed in tense standoff, neither side willing to surrender the advantage of their high ground by crossing the valley first. Then one morning, a singular figure emerged from the Philistine camp. Even from a distance, his immense size was apparent. This was Goliath of Gath, a warrior of legendary proportions, standing over 9 feet tall. His bronze armor gleamed in the morning sun, and his spear was like a weaver's beam. The very ground seemed to tremble with each step he took. Goliath's voice boomed across the valley. "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. If he can fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants." This challenge struck fear into the hearts of Saul and all the Israelites. Not a single warrior stepped forward to accept the giant's challenge. Morning and evening for 40 days, Goliath came forth with his taunting offer, and each time Israel's army trembled. It was during this time that David arrived at the camp, sent by his father Jesse to bring food to his 3 older brothers who served in Saul's army. As he reached the battlefield, the soldiers were moving into their battle positions, shouting the war cry. Excited to see his brothers, David left his supplies with the keeper of baggage and ran to the battle line. While David was speaking with his brothers, Goliath stepped forward with his usual challenge. David watched as the Israelite soldiers fled from the giant, and he heard them discussing the king's offer. Whoever killed the Philistine would receive great riches, the king's daughter in marriage, and tax exemption for his family. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? David asked, surprised by the fear he witnessed. His eldest brother Eliab heard this question and grew angry with David. "Why have you come down here? With whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your pride and the evil of your heart. You came down just to watch the battle." But David's words spread through the camp until they reached Saul, who summoned the young man to his tent. Standing before the king, David spoke with surprising confidence. "Let no one's heart fail because of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him." Saul looked doubtfully at the youth before him. "You cannot go against this Philistine to fight with him. You are just a boy, and he has been a warrior since his youth." David replied with quiet certainty, telling Saul how he had protected his father's sheep from lions and bears. "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." Something in David's confidence moved Saul. Perhaps it reminded him of his own early days, when faith had guided his actions. "Go then," he said at last, "and may the Lord be with you." Saul offered David his own armor, a bronze helmet, a coat of mail, and his sword. David tried them on, but found he could not move freely. "I cannot go with these," he said, "for I am not used to them." Instead, he took only his staff, his sling, and 5 smooth stones from the brook. As David approached Goliath, the giant looked upon the youth with disdain. "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" he roared. "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field." David stood his ground, unwavering before the massive warrior. His reply rang clear across the valley. "You come to me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head." With these words, David ran toward Goliath. As he ran, he placed a stone in his sling and whirled it above his head. With practiced skill honed through years of protecting his sheep, he released the stone, which flew straight and true, striking Goliath in the forehead. The giant fell face down on the earth. The fall of Goliath, David's first victory. The valley fell silent as the massive form of Goliath collapsed to the ground. For a moment, neither army moved, both stunned by the sight of the champion felled by a shepherd boy with nothing but a sling and stone. David approached the fallen giant, and since he had no sword of his own, he drew Goliath's weapon from its sheath. With the Philistine's own sword, he cut off the giant's head, confirming his victory beyond any doubt. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, panic spread through their ranks. The men of Israel and Judah raised a battle cry and pursued the fleeing Philistines all the way to the gates of Ekron. The road to Sharaim was strewn with the fallen as the Israelites drove their enemies from the land. David, still holding the head of Goliath, was brought before Saul by Abner, the commander of the army. The king looked at the young man with new eyes, scarcely able to believe what he had witnessed. "Whose son are you, young man?" Saul asked, his voice filled with wonder. "I am the son of your servant, Jesse, the Bethlehemite," David replied. News of the victory spread rapidly throughout Israel. As Saul and his army returned home, women came out from all the towns singing and dancing with tambourines and three-stringed instruments. Their joyful song echoed through the streets. Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s. This simple verse, born of celebration, planted a seed of jealousy in Saul's heart. The king had been praised for thousands, but this youth, this shepherd boy, was credited with tens of thousands. From that day forward, Saul viewed David with suspicion. The morning after the celebration, David was summoned to play the harp as usual, for Saul's dark mood had returned with greater force. As David played, trying to soothe the troubled king, Saul's hand closed around his spear. Suddenly, with no warning, he hurled it toward David, intending to pin him to the wall. David escaped the king's attack not once, but twice that day, slipping away before the spear found its mark. Saul recognized that the Lord had left him and was now with David. This realization only deepened his fear and resentment. The king removed David from his presence, making him a commander over 1,000 soldiers, ostensibly a promotion, but in truth an attempt to distance the young hero and perhaps even hope for his death in battle. Yet in everything David did, he acted wisely and succeeded, for the Lord was with him. All Israel and Judah loved David because he went out and came in before them with humility and courage. Rather than diminishing David's popularity, Saul's actions only increased it. Every challenge the king set before the young warrior became another opportunity for David to demonstrate his skill and wisdom. Seeing that David continued to prosper, Saul devised a new plan. He offered his daughter Merab to David as a wife, saying, "Only be valiant for me and fight the Lord's battles." In his heart, Saul thought, "Let not my hand be against him, but let the hand of the Philistines be against him." David responded with humility, "Who am I, and who are my relatives, my father's clan in Israel, that I should be son-in-law to the king?" When the time came for Merab to be given to David, she was given instead to Adriel the Maholathite as a wife. However, Saul's younger daughter Michal loved David. When this was reported to Saul, he saw another opportunity. "I will give her to him," he thought, "that she may be a snare for him, and that the hand of the Philistines may be against him." Saul instructed his servants to tell David privately, "The king desires no bride price except 100 foreskins of the Philistines, that he may be avenged of the king's enemies." Saul's hope was that David would fall by the hand of the Philistines during such a dangerous mission. But David rose and went with his men, striking down 200 Philistines. He brought their foreskins to the king to become his son-in-law. Saul gave him Michal as his wife, but seeing how the Lord was with David and how his daughter loved him, Saul became even more afraid. The king's fear grew into a settled enmity, making him David's enemy continually. Yet the more Saul opposed him, the more wisely David behaved. His name became highly esteemed throughout Israel, and stories of his courage spread far beyond the kingdom's borders. Young warriors flocked to serve under his command, drawn by his reputation for both bravery and wisdom. Unlike many who gained sudden fame, David maintained his humility, giving credit to God for his victories and treating his men with respect and fairness. David and Jonathan, the covenant of friendship. As David navigated the increasingly dangerous waters of Saul's court, one relationship emerged as a source of unexpected strength: his friendship with Jonathan, Saul's son and heir to the throne. By all conventional wisdom, these two should have been rivals. Jonathan, as the king's son, might have viewed David's rising popularity as a threat to his future reign. Yet something deeper than political calculation drew these young men together. Their bond began the day David defeated Goliath. As the young shepherd stood before Saul with the giant's head in his hands, Jonathan listened to their conversation. Something in David's manner, his courage mixed with humility, resonated deeply with the prince. Scripture tells us that the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. After David had finished speaking with Saul, Jonathan took a remarkable step. He removed his robe and gave it to David, along with his armor, his sword, his bow, and his belt. This was no simple gesture of generosity. It carried profound symbolic meaning. By giving David his princely robe, Jonathan was symbolically transferring his position. The weapons represented a transfer of power and authority. Most striking about this exchange was that Jonathan, the natural heir to Israel's throne, seemed to recognize something in David worth honoring above his own ambition. Perhaps he sensed the divine calling on David's life, or perhaps he simply valued true friendship above political power. Whatever his reasoning, Jonathan's action marked the beginning of a friendship that would become legendary. As Saul's jealousy toward David grew more dangerous, Jonathan found himself in an increasingly difficult position, caught between loyalty to his father and love for his friend. When Saul first spoke of killing David, Jonathan warned his friend and then interceded with his father on David's behalf. "Let not the king sin against his servant David," Jonathan pleaded, "because he has not sinned against you, and because his deeds have brought good to you." He took his life in his hand and struck down the Philistine, and the Lord worked a great salvation for all Israel. You saw it and rejoiced. Why then will you sin against innocent blood by killing David without cause? Saul listened to his son's appeal and swore, "As the Lord lives, he shall not be put to death." For a time, peace was restored. David returned to the court and served in Saul's presence as before, fighting Israel's battles and playing his harp when the king's dark moods descended. But Saul's promise proved short-lived. During another episode of torment, he again tried to pin David to the wall with his spear. David escaped and fled to his home, where Michal helped him escape through a window as Saul's men surrounded the house. That night, David became a fugitive from the king he had faithfully served. In the midst of this crisis, Jonathan's loyalty was tested as never before. David secretly returned and met with his friend outside the city. "What have I done?" he asked Jonathan. "What is my guilt? What is my sin before your father that he seeks my life?" Jonathan found it hard to believe his father would take such action without confiding in him. "Far from it. You shall not die. My father does nothing either great or small without disclosing it to me. Why should my father hide this from me? It is not so." But David insisted, "Your father knows well that I have found favor in your eyes, and he thinks, 'Do not let Jonathan know this, lest he be grieved.' But truly, as the Lord lives and as your soul lives, there is but a step between me and death." Together, they devised a plan to determine Saul's true intentions. David would miss the new moon feast, and Jonathan would observe his father's reaction. If Saul accepted David's absence without anger, it would be safe for him to return. If not, they would know that Saul was determined to kill him. Before parting, Jonathan and David formalized their friendship with a covenant. Jonathan, moved by his love for David, made him swear again because he loved him as he loved his own soul. "Tomorrow is the new moon," Jonathan said, "and you will be missed because your seat will be empty. On the third day, come to the place where you hid yourself before, and remain beside the stone heap. I will shoot 3 arrows to the side of it, as though I were shooting at a target. Then I will send the boy, saying, 'Go, find the arrows.' If I say to the boy, 'Look, the arrows are on this side of you, take them,' then you are to come, for it is safe for you, and there is no danger, as the Lord lives. But if I say to the youth, 'Look, the arrows are beyond you,' then go, for the Lord has sent you away." When the new moon feast arrived, Saul noticed David's empty place, but said nothing on the first day. On the second day, he questioned Jonathan about David's absence. Jonathan gave the agreed-upon excuse that David had asked permission to attend a family sacrifice in Bethlehem. Saul's rage exploded at his son. "You son of a perverse, rebellious woman, do I not know that you have chosen the son of Jesse to your own shame and to the shame of your mother's nakedness? For as long as the son of Jesse lives on the earth, neither you nor your kingdom shall be established. Send and bring him to me, for he shall surely die." When Jonathan defended David, Saul hurled his spear at his own son. Jonathan left the table in fierce anger, grieved for David because his father had disgraced him. The next morning, he went to the field at the time appointed with David, bringing a young boy with him. "Run and find the arrows that I shoot," he told the boy. As the boy ran, Jonathan shot an arrow beyond him and called out, "Is not the arrow beyond you?" Then he shouted, "Hurry, be quick, do not stay." After the boy had gathered the arrows and returned to the city, David emerged from his hiding place. He bowed 3 times before Jonathan, and they kissed one another and wept together, with David weeping the more. Saul's wrath, the spear and the fugitive. With Jonathan's warning confirming Saul's murderous intentions, David's life as a fugitive began in earnest. No longer could he return to his home, his wife, or his position in the royal court. The man who had been Israel's champion now fled like a hunted animal, never knowing where he might find safety or when the king's men might catch up with him. David's first stop was Nob, where the tabernacle of God stood. There he sought help from Ahimelech the priest, who was alarmed to see the king's son-in-law traveling alone. "Why are you alone, and no one with you?" the priest asked, his voice betraying his concern. David resorted to deception, explaining that he was on a secret mission for the king. "The king has charged me with a matter and said to me, 'Let no one know anything of the matter about which I send you.'" Hungry and unarmed, David asked Ahimelech for provisions and weapons. The priest had nothing to offer except the consecrated bread, the bread of the presence that had been removed from before the Lord to be replaced by hot bread. Normally, only priests could eat this holy bread, but given the emergency, Ahimelech provided it to David. "Is there not here a spear or a sword at hand?" David then asked. "I have brought neither my sword nor my weapons with me because the king's business required haste." "The sword of Goliath the Philistine, whom you killed in the valley of Elah, is here wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod," Ahimelech replied. "If you will take that, take it, for there is none but that here." "There is none like that," David said. "Give it to me." Thus armed with Goliath's sword, a fitting symbol of his greatest triumph, David continued his flight. Unknown to David, his visit to Nob had not gone unwitnessed. Doeg the Edomite, Saul's chief herdsman, was there that day and observed the interaction between David and the priest. From Nob, David fled to Gath, a Philistine city, where he sought refuge with King Achish. This was a desperate move, seeking safety among his former enemies. When the servants of Achish recognized him, saying, "Is not this David the king of the land? Did they not sing to one another of him in dances? Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s?" David became afraid and pretended to be insane, scratching on the doors and letting spittle run down his beard. "Look, you see the man is mad," Achish said to his servants. "Why then have you brought him to me? Do I lack madmen, that you have brought this fellow to behave as a madman in my presence?" Thanks to this ruse, David escaped from Gath. He found refuge in the cave of Adullam, where his family soon joined him after hearing of his location. Others gathered to him as well, everyone who was in distress, in debt, or bitter in soul. About 400 men joined him there, and he became their leader. Concerned for his parents' safety, David took them to Mizpeh of Moab and asked the king of Moab, "Please let my father and my mother stay with you till I know what God will do for me." They remained under the protection of the king of Moab, while David moved to the stronghold in the wilderness. The prophet Gad advised David, "Do not remain in the stronghold. Depart and go into the land of Judah." So David departed and went into the forest of Hereth. Meanwhile, King Saul heard that David had been discovered. Seated under the tamarisk tree on the height at Gibeah with his spear in hand and surrounded by his servants, Saul lamented, "Hear now, you Benjaminites. Will the son of Jesse give every one of you fields and vineyards? Will he make you all commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds, that all of you have conspired against me? No one discloses to me when my son makes a covenant with the son of Jesse. None of you is sorry for me or discloses to me that my son has stirred up my servant against me, to lie in wait, as at this day." At this moment, Doeg the Edomite spoke up. "I saw the son of Jesse coming to Ahimelech the son of Ahitub, who inquired of the Lord for him, and gave him provisions and the sword of Goliath the Philistine." Enraged, Saul summoned Ahimelech and all the priests of Nob. When they arrived, Saul confronted Ahimelech. "Why have you conspired against me, you and the son of Jesse, in that you have given him bread and a sword, and have inquired of God for him, so that he has risen against me, to lie in wait as at this day?" Ahimelech defended himself. "Who among all your servants is so faithful as David, who is the king's son-in-law and captain over your bodyguard and honored in your house? Is today the first time that I have inquired of God for him? No. Let not the king impute anything to his servant or to all the house of my father, for your servant has known nothing of all this, much or little." But Saul's mind was made up. "You shall surely die, Ahimelech, you and all your father's house," he declared, and ordered his guard to kill the priests of the Lord. When the guards refused to raise their hands against the priests, Saul turned to Doeg. "You turn and strike the priests." Doeg the Edomite obeyed, killing 85 persons who wore the linen ephod that day. He also struck Nob, the city of the priests, with the edge of the sword, men and women, children and infants, oxen, donkeys, and sheep. One son of Ahimelech named Abiathar escaped and fled to David, telling him what Saul had done. David responded with heavy guilt. "I knew on that day when Doeg the Edomite was there that he would surely tell Saul, 'I have occasioned the death of all the persons of your father's house.' Stay with me. Do not be afraid, for he who seeks my life seeks your life. With me you shall be in safekeeping." This massacre of the priests marked a turning point in Saul's reign. What had begun as jealousy had now transformed into murderous paranoia that spared not even the Lord's anointed servants. The king, who had once been chosen to deliver Israel, had become its terror. For David, the news brought fresh grief and guilt. The blood of the priests was on Saul's hands, but David recognized his own role in their fate. His deception at Nob had unintentionally led to their slaughter. It was a painful lesson in how one person's actions, even when motivated by self-preservation, could have devastating consequences for others. With Abiathar now in his company, David had access to priestly guidance and the ephod, the sacred vestment used in consulting the Lord. Despite the tragedy and danger, God's presence remained with the fugitive who would one day be king. The priests of Nob, consequences of Saul's paranoia. In his desperate flight from King Saul, David found himself alone and hungry. He came to the town of Nob, where Ahimelech the priest served at the tabernacle of God. The priest trembled as David approached, wondering why the king's son-in-law traveled without companions or guards. "Why are you alone?" asked Ahimelech with worry in his voice. David, thinking quickly, crafted a story about a secret mission from the king. The lie flowed easily from his lips, a sign of how far fear had pushed him from his honest nature. "I need bread for my journey," David told the priest, "and perhaps a weapon if you have one." Ahimelech had only the sacred bread, the show bread that had been before the Lord, which was meant only for the priests. Yet seeing David's need, he gave it to him, asking only if David and his imaginary men were ceremonially clean. He also gave David the sword of Goliath, kept as a trophy since that famous battle. What neither man knew was that watching from the shadows stood Doeg the Edomite, Saul's chief shepherd. His eyes narrowed as he observed this exchange, storing away every detail to report back to his increasingly unstable king. David continued his flight, finding safety among various groups, even among the Philistines for a time. But back in Saul's court, the wheels of tragedy had begun to turn. When Saul heard Doeg's report about the priests helping David, rage overtook him. He summoned Ahimelech and all the priests of Nob to his presence. 85 men wearing the linen ephod stood trembling before their king. "Why have you conspired against me?" Saul demanded, his voice rising with each word. "You gave David bread and a sword. You helped him escape." Ahimelech responded with confusion and innocence. "Who among your servants is as faithful as David, the king's son-in-law? I knew nothing of any conflict between you." Saul's face darkened. His mind, twisted by jealousy and fear, could not accept this truth. "You will die," he declared, "you and all your father's house." The king ordered his guards to kill the priests, but they refused, unwilling to raise their hands against the Lord's anointed servants. Saul then turned to Doeg the Edomite, who showed no such hesitation. With terrible efficiency, Doeg slaughtered all 85 priests. But Saul's wrath did not end there. He sent Doeg to Nob, the city of priests. There, every man, woman, child, and animal felt the edge of the sword. In one bloody day, an entire community was erased because they had unknowingly helped a fugitive. Only one priest escaped the massacre, Abiathar, son of Ahimelech. He fled to David, carrying the sacred ephod, bearing the terrible news of what had happened. When David heard of the slaughter, grief overcame him. He remembered Doeg's presence at Nob and realized his role in this tragedy. "I knew that day when Doeg was there," he admitted to Abiathar, "that he would tell Saul, 'I am responsible for the death of your family.'" The weight of those deaths settled on David's shoulders like a heavy cloak. These were innocent men who had only shown kindness to someone in need. Their blood had been spilled because of his deception. "Stay with me," David told Abiathar. "Don't be afraid. The one who seeks my life seeks yours also. With me, you will be protected." This tragedy marked David deeply. In the quiet nights that followed, he composed psalms expressing his anguish and guilt. Yet amid his grief, his faith in God's justice remained. He understood more clearly the dangerous path he walked, not just for himself, but for anyone who showed him kindness. The massacre at Nob revealed the depths of Saul's descent. A king chosen to protect his people had become their terror. The man who once consulted priests now slaughtered them without mercy. Saul's paranoia had consumed not just his reason, but his humanity. For David, the lesson was painful but clear. His actions affected others, sometimes with devastating consequences. From that day forward, he moved with greater caution, weighing each decision against the potential harm to innocent lives. The blood of the priests called him to a higher standard of leadership than Saul had shown. Life on the run. The caves and strongholds. After the tragedy at Nob, David's life became a constant rhythm of flight and hiding. The wilderness became his home, the stars his roof, and danger his constant companion. Word reached him that the Philistines were attacking the town of Keilah, stealing grain from the threshing floors. Despite being a fugitive himself, David's heart was moved by the people's plight. He asked God, "Shall I go and attack these Philistines?" The Lord answered, "Go, attack the Philistines and save Keilah." His men were less certain. "We're afraid here in Judah," they argued. "How much more if we go to Keilah against Philistine forces?" David sought God's guidance again and received the same answer. Strengthened by this assurance, David led his men to Keilah, defeated the Philistines, and saved the town. Yet gratitude could not overpower fear. When Saul heard David was in Keilah, he mobilized his army. "God has delivered him into my hand," Saul declared, "for he has trapped himself in a town with gates and bars." David, sensing danger, asked God if the people of Keilah would surrender him to Saul. The answer came, "They will." Without bitterness, David gathered his men, now about 600 strong, and departed before Saul arrived. They journeyed to the wilderness of Ziph, making camp among the hills and forests. David stayed in strongholds, moving frequently to avoid capture. The terrain was harsh, rocky, dry, with sparse vegetation. Water was precious, shade a luxury. But these wild places offered what cities could not: safety from Saul's spear. Jonathan, Saul's son, somehow found David in this remote place. Their meeting was brief but powerful. Jonathan strengthened David's faith with simple, heartfelt words. Don't be afraid. My father will not find you. You will be king over Israel, and I will be second to you. Even my father knows this is true." The two friends renewed their covenant before the Lord. Then Jonathan returned home while David remained in hiding. Their paths would cross only once more in this life. The men who gathered around David were a curious assembly. Some came out of loyalty, believing in God's anointing upon him. Others were distressed, in debt, or bitter about their lives. They were not soldiers, but became warriors under David's guidance. He trained them, led them, and shaped them into a fighting force, bound by loyalty stronger than blood. In caves lit by small fires, David taught these rough men the songs of faith he had composed. Their voices would echo against stone walls as they learned to praise the God who watched over them in their wilderness wanderings. The locals of Ziph, however, chose Saul's side. They sent messengers to the king. "David is hiding among us. Come down, and we will surrender him to you." Saul blessed them for their loyalty and instructed them to track David's movements precisely. So David and his men moved deeper into the wilderness to a region called Maon. Saul pursued them relentlessly. At one point, Saul's forces moved along one side of a mountain while David's men hurried along the opposite side. Just as Saul was about to overtake them, a messenger reached the king with urgent news. "Come quickly, the Philistines are raiding the land." Saul had no choice but to abandon his pursuit. David named that place Selah Hamalakoth, the rock of escape, recognizing God's hand in their deliverance. From there, David and his band traveled to the strongholds of En-Gedi, an oasis by the Dead Sea. Here, fresh water flowed from springs and vegetation brought color to the otherwise barren landscape. Caves dotted the steep cliffs, providing natural shelters. Life on the run taught David patience and resilience. Each day brought challenges, finding food, maintaining discipline among his men, avoiding detection. Yet these years also deepened his dependence on God. In the quiet of wilderness nights, with no palace roof to block his view, David studied the stars and composed psalms that would comfort troubled souls for generations to come. The shepherd boy was becoming a leader, learning skills no palace education could provide. He was discovering how to command loyalty, make quick decisions, and most importantly, how to wait on God's timing rather than force his own way to the throne. Have mercy in the cave, David spares Saul. After the Philistine threat had been dealt with, Saul resumed his pursuit of David with renewed determination. He selected 3,000 elite soldiers and led them toward the wilderness of En-Gedi, where steep cliffs and countless caves made perfect hiding places for fugitives. Word reached David that Saul was approaching. He and his men retreated deeper into the maze of caverns that honeycomb the region. The limestone formations, carved by water over countless years, created chambers large enough to hide dozens of men in darkness. Saul, tired from the journey, entered one of these caves to rest. By remarkable chance, or divine design, it was the very cave where David and his men were hiding in the far recesses, concealed by shadows. David's men could scarcely contain their excitement. "This is the day the Lord spoke of," they whispered urgently to David. "He has delivered your enemy into your hands. Do with him as you wish." David's heart raced. Here was his tormentor, alone and vulnerable. One quick thrust of a blade would end his exile and open the path to the throne. His men waited, expecting him to seize this perfect opportunity. Instead, David crept silently through the darkness toward the king. With a quick motion, he cut off a corner of Saul's royal robe, then slipped back into the shadows. Even this small act troubled his conscience deeply. "I cannot raise my hand against the Lord's anointed," he told his disappointed men, restraining them from attacking Saul. "This man, despite his flaws, was chosen by God. It is not my place to remove him." After Saul left the cave and moved some distance away, David emerged into the sunlight. "My lord the king," he called out. Saul turned, squinting to see who addressed him. David knelt with his face to the ground in a gesture of respect that surprised the watching armies. "Why do you listen when men say, 'David seeks to harm you'?" David asked. "Today your eyes have seen that the Lord delivered you into my hands in the cave. Some urged me to kill you, but I spared you. I said, 'I will not lift my hand against my Lord because he is the Lord's anointed.'" David held up the piece of cloth. "See this corner of your robe in my hand. I cut it off but did not kill you. Now understand that I am not guilty of wrongdoing or rebellion." The evidence was undeniable. Saul had been completely at David's mercy, yet still lived. The king's hard expression softened as the truth sank in. "Is that your voice, David, my son?" Saul asked, his voice breaking. Tears began streaming down his weathered face. "You are more righteous than I," he admitted. "You have treated me well, but I have treated you badly." In a moment of clarity, Saul acknowledged what he had long denied. "I know that you will surely be king and that the kingdom of Israel will be established in your hands." He asked only that David swear not to cut off his descendants or wipe out his name from his father's family when he came to power. David gave his oath freely. The two parted ways, Saul returning to his palace, David back to the strongholds of the wilderness. The reconciliation, though genuine in the moment, proved temporary. The calm would last only until jealousy and fear once again took hold of Saul's troubled mind. This encounter taught David an important lesson about power and restraint. Any man can strike when opportunity arises, but true greatness lies in knowing when to stay one's hand. His respect for God's anointing outweighed his personal desire for safety and position. In the quiet days that followed, David reflected on this strange meeting. He had not won the throne that day, but he had kept his integrity. By honoring God's timetable rather than forcing his own, he demonstrated the heart of a true king, one who could be trusted with power because he understood its limits and responsibilities. Nabal and Abigail, wisdom in the wilderness. In the wilderness of Paran, David and his men formed an unexpected alliance with local shepherds. Though fugitives themselves, they became protectors, keeping the flock safe from raiders and wild beasts. No sheep was lost under their watch, no shepherd harmed. They were like a wall around the flocks, day and night. Among the wealthy landowners of that region was a man called Nabal, whose vast property lay in Carmel. His name meant fool, an unfortunate but fitting description. Despite his considerable wealth, 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats, Nabal's heart was small, hard, and cold. When shearing time came, traditionally a season of celebration and generosity, David sent 10 young men to greet Nabal and request provisions. "Peace to you, your household, and all that is yours," they said politely. "Your shepherds have been with us, and we have not harmed them. Nothing of theirs has gone missing while we protected them. Ask your men and they will tell you. Please give whatever you can spare to your servants and to your son David." Nabal's response dripped with contempt. "Who is this David? Who is this son of Jesse?" he sneered. "Many servants are breaking away from their masters these days. Should I take my bread, water, and meat that I've prepared for my shearers and give it to men who come from who knows where?" When David's men returned with this insulting message, David's anger flared hot. "Put on your swords," he commanded. 400 men prepared for battle, while 200 stayed with their supplies. Meanwhile, one of Nabal's servants hurried to find Abigail, Nabal's wife. Beautiful and intelligent, she was as wise as her husband was foolish. "David sent messengers from the wilderness to greet our master," the servant explained, "but he hurled insults at them. Yet these men were very good to us. They were a wall around us day and night the whole time we were with them, tending the sheep. Disaster is hanging over our master and his household, but he is such a wicked man that no one can talk to him." Understanding the danger immediately, Abigail acted with swift decision. Without telling Nabal, she gathered 200 loaves of bread, 2 skins of wine, 5 dressed sheep, roasted grain, raisin cakes, and fig cakes. She loaded everything onto donkeys and told her servants, "Go ahead of me, I'll follow you." As she rode her donkey into a mountain ravine, she suddenly met David and his men descending toward her, armed for revenge. David had just vowed, "May God deal with me severely if by morning I leave alive one male of all who belong to him." Seeing David, Abigail quickly dismounted and bowed low to the ground. She fell at his feet and spoke with respectful wisdom. "My lord, let the blame be on me alone. Please let your servant speak to you. Hear what I have to say. May my lord pay no attention to that wicked man, Nabal. He is just like his name. His name means fool, and folly goes with him." She acknowledged that she hadn't seen David's men when they came, but assured him that the Lord kept him from bloodshed and from avenging himself. The provisions she brought were for David's men, and she humbly asked forgiveness for any offense. Then Abigail spoke prophetically. "The Lord your God will certainly make a lasting dynasty for my lord, because you fight the Lord's battles and no wrongdoing will be found in you, as long as you live." She described how God would fulfill all he had promised to David, and how David would be spared the burden of needless bloodshed. David's anger melted away at her words. He recognized God's hand in sending her to prevent him from a terrible mistake. "Praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, who has sent you today to meet me," he told her. "May you be blessed for your good judgment and for keeping me from bloodshed this day and from avenging myself with my own hands." David accepted her gifts and sent her home in peace. "I have heard your words and granted your request," he assured her. When Abigail returned home, she found Nabal holding a banquet, like that of a king. He was very drunk, so she told him nothing until morning. In the sobering light of dawn, she related everything that had happened. Nabal's heart failed him, and he became like stone. About 10 days later, the Lord struck Nabal, and he died. When David heard that Nabal was dead, he recognized divine justice in this outcome. "Praise be to the Lord, who has upheld my cause against Nabal for treating me with contempt. He has kept his servant from doing wrong and has brought Nabal's wrongdoing down on his own head." Impressed by Abigail's character, David sent word asking her to become his wife. She humbly accepted and journeyed to him with 5 attendants. Thus the woman who had saved many lives with her wisdom became joined to the future king. Through this encounter, David learned valuable lessons about hasty anger and the wisdom of restraint. Had he carried out his vengeance against Nabal, the blood guilt would have stained his reign before it began. By listening to wise counsel, he avoided a grave mistake. This experience prepared him for the greater challenges of kingship that lay ahead. The second mercy, the spear and the jug. Despite the brief reconciliation at En-Gedi, Saul's heart again hardened toward David. The men of Ziph, eager to win royal favor, went to Saul with information about David's whereabouts. "Is not David hiding on the hill of Hakilah, opposite Jeshimon?" they reported. Saul gathered 3,000 chosen men and set up camp on the very hill the informants had mentioned. David, learning of Saul's arrival, sent out scouts who confirmed the king's presence. Under cover of darkness, David slipped close to examine the camp himself. The royal encampment formed a circle, with Saul and his general Abner sleeping in the center, surrounded by sleeping soldiers. Spears were stuck in the ground near each man's head, ready to be grabbed at the first sign of danger. The camp seemed secure, guarded by concentric rings of warriors. David turned to two companions, Ahimelech the Hittite and Abishai, son of his sister Zeruiah. "Who will go down with me to Saul's camp?" he whispered. "I'll go with you," Abishai answered without hesitation. Under the cover of night, the two men moved silently past the sleeping guards. The darkness was their ally, and a deep sleep from the Lord had fallen upon the camp. Not a sentry stirred as they stepped carefully between rows of slumbering soldiers. They reached the center where Saul lay sleeping. His spear was stuck in the ground near his head, and a jug of water stood nearby. Abishai whispered to David, "Today God has delivered your enemy into your hands. Now let me pin him to the ground with one thrust of the spear. I won't strike him twice." The opportunity seemed perfect, even more decisive than the chance in the cave. Yet David's response showed his character had only strengthened through his trials. "Don't destroy him," David commanded. "Who can lay a hand on the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? As surely as the Lord lives, the Lord himself will strike him, or his time will come to die naturally, or he will go into battle and perish. But the Lord forbid that I should lay a hand on the Lord's anointed." Instead of allowing violence, David instructed Abishai, "Take the spear and water jug near his head, and let's go." They removed these items and slipped away unnoticed. Not a single person saw or knew what had happened, for the sleep from the Lord was heavy upon them. Once at a safe distance, David climbed to the top of a hill overlooking the camp. From this vantage point, he called out, "Abner, son of Ner, will you not answer?" Abner, startled from sleep, responded, "Who calls to the king?" "Are you not a man, Abner?" David taunted. "Who is like you in Israel? Why didn't you guard your lord the king? Someone came to destroy your lord the king. You have not done well at all. As surely as the Lord lives, you and your men deserve to die because you did not guard your master, the Lord's anointed. Look around you. Where are the king's spear and water jug that were near his head?" Saul recognized David's voice. "Is that your voice, David, my son?" he called out. "It is my voice, my lord the king," David replied. "Why is my lord pursuing his servant? What have I done? What wrong am I guilty of? If the Lord has stirred you up against me, then may he accept an offering. But if men have done it, may they be cursed before the Lord. They have driven me today from my share in the Lord's inheritance, saying, 'Go serve other gods.' Now don't let my blood fall to the ground far from the presence of the Lord." David's words struck deep. For a second time, Saul confronted undeniable evidence of David's mercy and honor. For a second time, his hardened heart briefly softened. "I have sinned," Saul admitted. "Come back, David, my son. Because you considered my life precious today, I will not try to harm you again. I have played the fool and have committed a grave error." David arranged for the return of the royal spear, saying, "Here is the king's spear. Let one of your young men come over and get it. The Lord rewards everyone for their righteousness and faithfulness. The Lord delivered you into my hands today, but I would not lay a hand on the Lord's anointed. As I valued your life today, so may the Lord value my life and deliver me from all trouble." Saul blessed David before they parted ways. "May you be blessed, David, my son. You will do great things and surely triumph." Yet David had learned the pattern of Saul's unstable mind. Though the king's remorse seemed genuine, David knew it would not last. He had twice spared Saul and twice received temporary repentance. There would not be a third opportunity. David decided then that his only path to safety lay beyond the borders of Israel. As long as he remained in Saul's kingdom, the pursuit would eventually resume. With heavy heart but clear vision, he prepared to seek refuge in the most unlikely of places, among the Philistines, traditional enemies of his people. Through this second act of mercy, David again demonstrated the heart that qualified him for kingship. He understood that authority came from God alone, not from his own actions or timing. By refusing to seize power through violence, he proved himself worthy of receiving it through divine appointment. Refuge with the Philistines, the unexpected ally. Life as a fugitive had worn David down. Each day brought fresh dangers and challenges. The constant fear of Saul's pursuit had left him weary. After much thought, David made a bold choice. He would seek shelter with the very people he had once fought against, the Philistines. "I will surely die at Saul's hand one day," David told his 600 men. "There's nothing better for me than to escape to Philistine land. Then Saul will give up searching for me in Israel, and I'll be out of his reach." David approached Achish, king of Gath, with a humble request for sanctuary. This was not their first meeting. Years earlier, David had fled to Gath alone, pretending madness to escape. Now he returned as a powerful leader with hundreds of warriors at his command. Achish welcomed David, seeing the advantage of having Israel's greatest warrior now allied with him against Saul. The Philistine king gave David the town of Ziklag as his own. This small border town would be David's home for the next 16 months. Life among the Philistines was filled with strange tensions. These people had been Israel's enemies for generations. They had sent Goliath against the Israelites. Now David broke bread with them and lived under their protection. In this odd sanctuary, David's thoughts often turned to the irony of his situation. He who had killed their champion now slept safely in their land. The same hands that had placed Goliath's head in Jerusalem now accepted food from Philistine tables. God's ways rarely followed the neat patterns men expected. David played a dangerous game during this time. He would tell Achish he was raiding Israelite settlements, but in truth, he attacked other enemies of Israel, the Geshurites, the Girzites, and the Amalekites. These were ancient foes who lived in the lands stretching towards Shur and Egypt. With careful planning, David left no witnesses to tell the real story. He took the livestock and possessions, but killed everyone in the villages he raided. When Achish would ask, "Where did you raid today?" David would answer with deliberate vagueness, "Against the Negev of Judah," or "against the Negev of Jerahmeel," or "against the Negev of the Canaanites." Achish grew to trust David completely, believing he had become hated by his own people and would serve the Philistines forever. "He has made himself utterly hated by his people Israel," Achish thought, "so he'll be my servant forever." This mistaken trust would serve David well in the days to come. The life of faith often takes unexpected turns. David found himself protected by former enemies while running from the king of his own people. In the quiet nights of Ziklag, David wrote psalms expressing his trust that God had not forgotten him, even in this strange land. "I sought the Lord, and he answered me. He delivered me from all my fears," he wrote under the stars of Philistia. Though far from the tabernacle and the land of promise, David felt God's presence. The shepherd boy was learning that God's sanctuary wasn't limited to sacred spaces in Israel. It could be found even in the land of enemies. During these months, David's reputation grew. More warriors from Israel slipped away to join him. Even some of Saul's relatives came over to David's side, sensing that God's favor had shifted. Men from the tribe of Benjamin, Saul's own tribe, pledged their loyalty to David. Warriors from Gad crossed the Jordan to find him. David's band became a small army of mighty men, each with tales of remarkable courage. Some could use both right hand and left in slinging stones and shooting arrows. Others had faces like lions and were as swift as gazelles on the mountains. They came to him in the wilderness and at Ziklag, all ready to help him in battle. This time among the Philistines shaped David's future rule. He learned the ways of his enemies, their strengths and weaknesses. He observed how Achish governed and built alliances. Even in this foreign place, far from the promised land, David was being prepared for his future throne. The months in Ziklag taught David lessons no prophet could have taught him. He learned to live among people of different customs and beliefs. He learned to maintain his faith while surrounded by those who worshipped other gods. He learned the delicate balance of respect without compromise. These lessons would serve him well when he ruled a kingdom filled with diverse tribes and bordering many foreign nations. Ziklag. the fateful city. Ziklag became more than just a refuge. The small town grew into David's base of operations. Here his wives joined him, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail, former wife of Nabal. In this quiet place they established something like a normal life, away from the constant threat of Saul's spear. The town sat on the edge of the desert, a place between worlds, not fully in Philistia, not quite in Israel. Like David himself, it existed on the border between identities. By day, David would train his men and plan his raids. By night, he would play his harp and compose the songs that would later become psalms. "The Lord is my shepherd," he would sing, remembering his own days tending sheep. "I shall not want." These words brought comfort to his followers, men who had left everything behind to follow him into an uncertain future. As days turned to weeks and weeks to months, Ziklag became home. David's men built stronger walls and better houses. Their wives planted gardens. Children played in the dusty streets. It was a strange mix of domestic peace and warrior readiness. Each morning brought training with sword and bow. Each evening brought family meals and stories around fires. David knew this peace couldn't last forever. He was still caught between two worlds, trusted neither fully by Israel nor truly by the Philistines. This border existence would eventually force a choice. Still, he made the most of this season of relative calm, strengthening his men and deepening his faith. One day, news came that made David's heart sink. The Philistines were gathering their forces for a major battle against Israel. Achish expected David and his men to join them. "You must understand that you and your men will accompany me in the army," the king told David. David gave a careful answer. "Then you will see for yourself what your servant can do." Achish was pleased, not hearing the subtle uncertainty in David's words. The Philistine king even appointed David as his personal bodyguard for the coming battle. This put David in an impossible position. How could he fight against his own people? How could he raise his sword against the Lord's anointed king? Yet refusing would expose his deception and endanger everyone in Ziklag. As David prepared for the march north, he must have prayed for a way out of this dilemma. His men looked to him with questioning eyes. They had followed him through caves and wilderness, but would they follow him against their own brothers? David had no answers to give them, only a quiet confidence that God would make a path. As David marched north with the Philistine armies, his mind worked through every possible option. Would he have to betray Achish, who had protected him? Or would he have to fight against his homeland? God seemed to have led him into an impossible test. Then came unexpected help. The other Philistine rulers didn't share Achish's trust in David. "What about these Hebrews?" they demanded when they saw David and his men in the rear ranks. "Is this not David, the one they sing about in their dances? Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands." "Send the man back to the place you assigned him," they insisted to Achish. "He must not go with us into battle, or he'll turn against us during the fighting. How better could he regain his master's favor than by taking the heads of our own men?" Despite Achish's protests that David had been loyal, the other lords held firm. "Send him back." With mixed feelings of relief and concern, David and his men were told to return to Ziklag while the Philistines continued toward the battle. David put on a convincing show of disappointment. "What have I done?" he asked Achish. "What have you found against your servant from the day I came to you until now? Why can't I go and fight against the enemies of my lord the king?" But in his heart, David knew God had provided a way out of his impossible situation. The journey back took 3 days. As they traveled, David and his men must have felt growing unease. They had been gone too long. The town had been left with minimal defense. In a land of raiders and enemies, anything could have happened in their absence. When they finally crested the last hill and looked down on Ziklag, a terrible sight met their eyes. The town was a smoking ruin. While they had been away, Amalekite raiders had attacked, burning the settlement and taking everyone captive, all their wives, sons, and daughters. David's men wept until they had no strength left to weep. Then grief turned to anger, and some spoke of stoning David. Had he not led them into this disaster, first marching with the Philistines, then returning to this devastation? It all seemed too much to bear. In this dark moment, the true measure of David's character showed itself. The text tells us simply, David found strength in the Lord his God. When all others lost hope, when blame fell heavy on his shoulders, David turned to the one source of strength that had never failed him. David called for the priest Abiathar to bring the ephod, the sacred vestment used to inquire of God. "Shall I pursue this raiding party?" David asked the Lord. "Will I overtake them?" The answer came clear, "Pursue them. You will certainly overtake them and succeed in the rescue." With renewed purpose, David gathered his 600 men and set out after the Amalekites. The chase led them to the Besor Valley, where 200 men were too exhausted to go further. David pressed on with the remaining 400, following tracks across the desert. They found an Egyptian slave who had been abandoned by the Amalekites. He had gone 3 days without food or water. David's men gave him food and water, then learned he could lead them to the Amalekite camp. The man had been left behind because he fell ill, a small mercy that would now bring disaster to his former masters. David found the Amalekites spread out across the land, eating, drinking, and celebrating their successful raids. With careful planning, David attacked at twilight. The battle lasted until evening of the next day. When it ended, David had recovered everything, all the women and children, all the livestock and goods. Nothing was missing. The return to the ruins of Ziklag was a time of bittersweet joy. Families were reunited, but their homes were gone. They had recovered their possessions, but the security they had built was destroyed. It was time to think about the next step. But first, there would be news from the north that would change everything. The death of Saul, the Battle of Gilboa. While David dealt with the crisis at Ziklag, far to the north, a great battle was brewing. The Philistine forces had gathered at Shunem, while Saul and the Israelite army camped at Mount Gilboa. The night before battle, fear gripped Saul's heart like never before. The aging king looked across the valley at the vast Philistine forces. Their chariots and infantry covered the valley floor like a swarm of locusts. Saul had fought the Philistines many times before, but never had he faced such overwhelming odds. Never had he felt so alone. Samuel was dead. The great prophet who had anointed him king, who had guided him through the early years of his reign, was no more. God no longer answered his prayers, not by dreams, nor by Urim, nor by prophets. The silence from heaven was deafening. Desperate for guidance, Saul did something he had once forbidden. He sought out a medium, a woman who claimed to speak with the dead. The law of Moses strictly prohibited such practices, and Saul himself had expelled mediums and spiritists from the land. Now in his desperation, he turned to what he had once condemned. Disguised and under cover of night, Saul traveled to Endor, where such a woman lived. With 2 attendants, he made the dangerous journey past Philistine positions to reach her home. "Bring up Samuel for me," he begged, after assuring her she wouldn't be punished. To the woman's own terror, the prophet's spirit actually appeared. This was no trick or illusion. Even she was frightened by what she saw. "I see a divine being coming up out of the ground," she told Saul. When she described an old man wrapped in a robe, Saul knew it was Samuel and bowed low to the ground. Samuel's message was grim. "Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up?" the prophet asked. Saul poured out his distress. The Philistines were attacking. God had turned away. No answers came through normal channels. But Samuel offered no comfort. "The Lord has done what he predicted through me," Samuel told the king. "The Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hands and given it to your neighbor, to David." Then came the terrible prophecy. "Tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. The Lord will also give the army of Israel into the hands of the Philistines." Saul collapsed, falling full length on the ground. He had not eaten all day and night, and now this news drained what little strength remained. The medium urged him to eat something, preparing a meal from her fatted calf and fresh bread. Saul ate, then rose and left under the cover of darkness. It would be his last meal. Dawn broke on Mount Gilboa with this terrible prophecy hanging over Saul. The sunrise painted the eastern sky red, a soldier's warning. The Philistines attacked with full force. The battle quickly turned against Israel. Saul watched in horror as his army began to break and flee up the slopes of the mountain. The Philistine archers found their range. Arrows rained down on the Israelite positions. Saul was hit and badly wounded. His sons fought bravely around him, but one by one they fell. Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchi-Shua All died that day on the battlefield. As the enemy closed in, Saul found himself cornered. His armor-bearer stood by him, loyal to the end. The king, who had once stood head and shoulders above other men, now faced his final moments in pain and defeat. "Kill me," Saul begged his armor-bearer, fearing capture and torture. "Don't let these uncircumcised fellows come and run me through and abuse me." But the young man refused, terrified at the thought of killing the Lord's anointed king. With his last strength, Saul took his own sword and fell on it. His armor-bearer, seeing that Saul was dead, also fell on his sword. The king, who had started with such promise, died a tragic death alongside 3 of his sons. The next day, Philistine soldiers searching among the dead found Saul's body. They cut off his head and stripped off his armor, sending these trophies throughout Philistia to proclaim the news in the temples of their idols and among the people. They hung Saul's body on the wall of Beth-shan as a final humiliation. When the people of Jabesh-Gilead heard what had happened, they remembered how Saul had once saved their city early in his reign. Brave men marched through the night, took down the bodies of Saul and his sons from the wall of Beth-shan, and brought them back to Jabesh. There they burned the bodies, then buried the bones under a tamarisk tree. They fasted 7 days to mourn Israel's fallen king. This act of loyalty would not be forgotten, even by the new king who would soon take the throne. So ended the reign of Israel's first king, in defeat, death, and disgrace. The throne that David had been anointed to take now stood empty. The shepherd boy turned warrior would become king, but first he would mourn deeply for those lost on Mount Gilboa. David's Lament. The song for Saul and Jonathan. 3 days after returning to the ruins of Ziklag, a young Amalekite arrived at David's camp. Dirt covered his clothes and his face showed the weariness of hard travel. He bore news from the battlefield and Saul's crown and armband as proof of his tale. "Where have you come from?" David asked. The young man fell to the ground in respect. "I've escaped from the Israelite camp," he answered. "What happened?" David pressed him, heart racing. "Tell me." The camp had grown silent, men gathering to hear news from the north. "The men fled from the battle," the messenger said. "Many have fallen and died, and Saul and his son Jonathan are dead." The words fell heavy on the air. Though long expected, the reality of Saul's death struck David with unexpected force. "How do you know that Saul and his son Jonathan are dead?" David demanded. The young man, an Amalekite who had been living in Israel, proceeded to tell a story that conflicted with the actual events. Perhaps hoping for a reward, he claimed to have delivered the final blow to Saul himself. "I happened to be on Mount Gilboa," the young man told David. Saul was leaning on his spear with the chariots and riders almost upon him. He turned and saw me, and called me over. He asked me to stand over him and kill him, for he was in the throes of death, but still alive. So I stood over him and killed him, because I knew that after he had fallen, he could not survive. To prove his story, the messenger presented Saul's crown and the armband from his arm. "I took them and have brought them here to my lord," he said, clearly expecting praise or reward for his actions. David and his men tore their clothes in grief. They wept and fasted until evening for Saul, for Jonathan, and for the army of Israel that had fallen by the sword. Despite years of running from Saul's spear, David's heart broke at the news of the king's death. The young Amalekite stood confused. He had expected celebration at the news of Saul's death. Wasn't this the man who had hunted David like a partridge in the mountains? Instead, he faced a room of mourning warriors with torn garments and tear-stained faces. David turned to the messenger with steel in his eyes. "Why weren't you afraid to lift your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed one?" he demanded. The young man stammered, realizing too late his error. David called one of his men over. "Go, strike him down," he ordered. The soldier drew his sword and killed the Amalekite. "Your blood be on your own head," David said over the body. "Your own mouth testified against you when you said, 'I killed the Lord's anointed.'" Even in death, David showed Saul the respect due to the king chosen by God. In his grief, David composed a song of lament. He called it the Bow, and ordered that it be taught to everyone in Judah. For generations to come, the people would remember Saul and Jonathan through these words of honor and grief. The song began with a cry from the heart. "Your glory, O Israel, is slain on your high places. How the mighty have fallen." These opening lines would become a refrain repeated throughout the lament. David's words painted the mountains as cursed. Mountains of Gilboa, may you have neither dew nor rain, may no showers fall on your terraced fields. For there the shield of the mighty was defiled, the shield of Saul, no longer rubbed with oil. His voice broke as he sang of Saul and Jonathan. They were swifter than eagles, they were stronger than lions. From the blood of the slain, from the flesh of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan did not turn back, the sword of Saul did not return unsatisfied. For Saul, once his bitter enemy, David found generous words. Daughters of Israel, weep for Saul, who clothed you in scarlet and finery, who adorned your garments with ornaments of gold. He remembered not the king's failures and jealousy, but his accomplishments and glory. But it was for Jonathan that David's grief cut deepest. I grieve for you, Jonathan, my brother. You were very dear to me. Your love for me was wonderful, more wonderful than that of women. Their friendship had been one of the purest treasures of David's hard years as a fugitive. The bond between the two young men had transcended the hate that drove Saul. Jonathan had given David his robe, his tunic, his sword, his bow, and his belt, symbols of his princely status and his commitment to David's rise. He had warned David of Saul's plots, defended him before the king, and made a covenant of lasting friendship. Now that bright light was extinguished. Jonathan, who should have stood at David's right hand in the coming kingdom, lay dead on Mount Gilboa. The prince who had willingly stepped aside for God's chosen king would never see the fulfillment of what he had helped to bring about. The lament ended with the mournful refrain, "How the mighty have fallen, the weapons of war have perished." With these words, David closed the chapter on Saul's reign and prepared to step into his own destiny. The people who heard this song were moved by David's gracious spirit. Here was a man who could honor his fallen enemy, who refused to rejoice in Saul's death. This showed wisdom beyond David's years, the kind of wisdom Israel would need in a new king. In the weeks that followed, copies of the bow spread throughout Judah. Warriors sang it around campfires. Women taught it to their children. The lament preserved the memory of Saul and Jonathan not as they had fallen, but as they had been in their glory, mighty warriors of Israel. David returns to Judah, the rise to power. After mourning, David sought God's guidance. "Shall I go up to one of the towns of Judah?" he asked. The Lord answered, "Go up." When David asked where, the answer came, "To Hebron." So David traveled to Hebron with his 2 wives and all his men, each with his family. The journey from Ziklag took them out of Philistine territory and back to the land of Israel. After years in exile, David was coming home. Hebron sat nestled among the hills of Judah, an ancient city with deep roots in Israel's history. Abraham had lived there. The patriarchs were buried there. Now it would become the first capital of David's kingdom. The men of Judah came to Hebron and anointed David king over the tribe of Judah. At 30 years old, David finally wore the crown he had been promised as a youth. Yet this was not complete fulfillment. He ruled only one tribe, not all Israel. This partial kingship reflected the divided state of the nation. The northern tribes had not yet accepted David. The prophecy spoken over him as a shepherd boy was only beginning to unfold. There would be more waiting, more testing of his patience and faith. One of David's first acts showed his political wisdom. He sent messengers to the men of Jabesh-Gilead, saying, "The Lord bless you for showing this kindness to Saul your master by burying him. May the Lord now show you kindness and faithfulness, and I too will show you the same favor because you have done this." By honoring those who had honored Saul, David built bridges with people who might have opposed him. He added, "Now then, be strong and brave, for Saul your master is dead, and the house of Judah has anointed me king over them." This gentle invitation to accept his kingship showed David's diplomatic skill. Meanwhile, in the north, Saul's surviving son Ishbosheth had been made king over the remaining tribes. Abner, Saul's powerful army commander, stood behind this choice. Israel was now a divided nation with 2 kings claiming the throne. Abner took Ishbosheth, son of Saul, and brought him over to Mahanaim. There he made him king over Gilead, Ashuri, Jezreel, Ephraim, Benjamin, over all Israel except Judah. Ishbosheth was 40 years old when he became king over Israel, and he reigned 2 years. The house of Judah, however, followed David. Tension between the 2 kingdoms soon erupted into violence. Abner led Ishbosheth's men to Gibeon, where they met Joab and David's men at the pool. The two forces sat on opposite sides, eyeing each other warily. Abner suggested a contest. 12 young men from each side would fight each other. The clash turned deadly as each man grabbed his opponent by the head and thrust his sword into his side. All 24 fell together. What began as a demonstration of skill became a slaughter, and the place was called Helkath Hazarim, the Field of Daggers. A fierce battle broke out, and Abner and the men of Israel were defeated by David's forces. During the fighting, Asahel, Joab's brother, chased Abner across the battlefield. Though warned repeatedly to turn aside, the fleet-footed Asahel refused to give up the pursuit. Finally, Abner thrust the butt end of his spear backward, this caught striking Asahel in the stomach. The spear came out through his back, and he fell and died on the spot. This death would have long-lasting consequences, setting up a blood feud between Joab and Abner that would eventually undermine David's plans for peace. The battle at Gibeon marked the beginning of a long war between the house of Saul and the house of David. This was not the clean transition of power that David might have hoped for. Instead, it was a grinding conflict that tested both kingdoms and cost many lives. During this time, David's position grew gradually stronger, while the house of Saul weakened. The text says simply, David grew stronger and stronger, while the house of Saul grew weaker and weaker. God's promise was being fulfilled, not in a single dramatic moment, but through the slow turning of events. For 2 years, David ruled from Hebron as king of Judah. During this time, his family grew. His wife, Ahinoam, gave birth to his firstborn son, Amnon. Abigail bore Kileab. 4 more sons were born to him by other wives he married in Hebron: Absalom son of Maacah, Adonijah son of Haggith, Shephatiah son of Abital, and Ithream son of Eglah. David's power grew steadily. More men came to serve him. The southern tribes prospered under his leadership. People saw that the hand of God was with him, blessing his decisions and expanding his influence. Yet David did not march north to claim the rest of Israel by force. He waited, allowing God's promise to unfold in God's time. The lessons of patience learned during his years as a fugitive now shaped his actions as king. This period of ruling in Hebron would last 7.5 years. It was a time of growing strength, of consolidating power, and of learning to be king. The shepherd boy had become a ruler, but the greatest chapters of his story were still to come. Eventually, events would bring the rest of Israel to David's door. Abner would quarrel with Ishbosheth and switch his allegiance to David. Before this could bear fruit, Joab would murder Abner, complicating the peace process. Then Ishbosheth himself would be assassinated by 2 of his captains, hoping to win David's favor. Through all these twists and turns, David maintained his integrity. He executed the men who killed Ishbosheth, making it clear that he would not accept murder as a path to power. Eventually, all the tribes would come to him at Hebron, acknowledging what God had ordained years before, that David should be king over all Israel. But those events lay in the future. For now, David ruled in Hebron, building his strength, awaiting God's timing, and learning the skills of kingship that would make him Israel's greatest ruler. The boy who had faced Goliath was becoming the man who would establish a dynasty. # the house of Saul versus the house of David. After being crowned king of Judah in Hebron, David's path to ruling all Israel still faced obstacles. Saul's surviving son, Ishbosheth, had been proclaimed king over the northern tribes through the support of Abner, Saul's powerful army commander. The land was now divided, David ruling Judah in the south and Ishbosheth governing the rest of Israel in the north. This division sparked a lengthy conflict between the 2 royal houses. Though neither king sought open warfare, their generals and warriors often clashed in the borderlands. The Bible tells us this struggle continued for years, with David's forces slowly gaining the upper hand as his reputation for wisdom and military skill spread throughout the land. Abner, once fiercely loyal to Saul's memory, grew increasingly frustrated with Ishbosheth's weak leadership. The final break came when Ishbosheth accused Abner of taking one of Saul's concubines, a claim that could suggest Abner had designs on the throne himself. Deeply offended, Abner decided to switch his allegiance to David. In secret meetings, Abner promised to bring the northern tribes under David's rule. This shift might have changed everything, But history took another turn when Joab, David's nephew and military commander, killed Abner to avenge his brother's death in an earlier battle. David publicly mourned Abner and made it clear he had not ordered the killing, helping preserve the fragile peace talks with the northern tribes. Without Abner's protection, Ishbosheth's reign crumbled. Two of his captains, hoping to win favor with David, murdered the king in his bed and brought his head to David. But instead of rewarding them, David had them executed for killing an innocent man in his sleep. This act of justice, honoring his former rival despite their differences, earned David respect among the northern tribes. The war between the houses of David and Saul lasted 7 years in total. Throughout this time, David stayed in Hebron, strengthening his position through marriages to women from important families and building alliances with neighboring clans. His patience and restraint during this period showed remarkable wisdom. Rather than forcing his rule on the northern tribes, he waited for them to recognize him willingly. With both Abner and Ishbosheth gone, the northern tribes found themselves without leadership. They remembered David's victories against their enemies during Saul's reign and his fair treatment of the house of Saul, even in defeat. Gradually, the people's hearts turned toward the shepherd king, who had once played his harp for their troubled King Saul. The elders of the northern tribes finally journeyed to Hebron. There, they acknowledged David as their rightful king, citing his military prowess and God's promise that David would shepherd all Israel. The long war between the houses was over at last, not through conquest, but through reconciliation. The unification of Israel. David becomes king of all tribes. The elders of Israel came to David at Hebron bearing olive branches and gifts. They spoke of how, even in the days when Saul was king, it was David who truly led Israel in battle. More importantly, they remembered God's words to David, "You will shepherd my people Israel, and you will become their ruler." Under the ancient oak trees of Hebron, David made a sacred covenant with the elders before the Lord. The Bible tells us he was 30 years old when he became king, and he would reign for 40 years in total. The first 7 years he ruled only Judah from Hebron, but now he would govern a unified nation from a new capital. After the ceremony, trumpets sounded and celebrations began throughout the land. For the first time since the days of the judges, all 12 tribes were united under one king. The people rejoiced at this new beginning, hoping for peace after years of internal strife. David understood that to truly unite the tribes, he needed a capital city that belonged to no single tribe, a neutral ground where all Israelites could feel welcome. His gaze fell upon Jerusalem, still held by the Jebusites, who had controlled the city since before the Israelites entered the Promised Land. The Jebusites felt secure behind Jerusalem's massive walls, built upon steep limestone ridges. When David's forces approached, they mocked him from the walls. "Even the blind and lame can keep you out." But David knew the city's secret weakness, an ancient water shaft that led from the Gihon spring up into the city. David offered a reward to the first warrior who could climb the water shaft and open the gates from within. Joab, ever ambitious, took the challenge and led a small band of men through the narrow passage. Under cover of darkness, they emerged inside the walls and opened the gates for David's army. The capture of Jerusalem marked a turning point in David's reign. He renamed it the City of David and began transforming the former Jebusite stronghold into a magnificent capital. Workers from Tyre, skilled in stonework and woodcraft, came to help build David's palace using the famous cedars of Lebanon. Unlike other conquests of the time, David allowed the Jebusites to remain in the city, living alongside the Israelites. This pattern of inclusion rather than destruction would become a hallmark of David's rule. The once divided tribes now had a shared center of government, trade, and eventually worship. From Jerusalem, David organized his kingdom with remarkable skill. He appointed judges to settle disputes fairly, regardless of tribal affiliation. He established a standing army while maintaining the tribal militia system. Most importantly, he created a royal court that included representatives from all 12 tribes, ensuring every voice could be heard in his council. These changes transformed Israel from a loose confederation of tribes into a true nation. Trade flourished along routes that had previously been disrupted by tribal conflicts. farmers could plant their fields without fear of raids from neighboring tribes. For the first time in generations, the promise of the Promised Land seemed fulfilled. In all these achievements, David never forgot the source of his authority. The Bible tells us that David knew that the Lord had established him as king over Israel and had exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people. This humility, rare among ancient kings, endeared him to the people and kept him faithful to his calling. The Ark of the Covenant, a city for God. With Jerusalem secured as his capital, David turned his thoughts to the Ark of the Covenant. This sacred chest, overlaid with gold and topped with golden cherubim, contained the stone tablets of the Ten Commandments. For generations, it had been the most holy symbol of God's presence among the Israelites. Since the days of Eli the priest, the Ark had sat neglected in the house of Abinadab in Kiriath-Jearim. The worship of God had become scattered, with different tribes maintaining their own shrines and altars. David dreamed of bringing the Ark to Jerusalem, making his capital not just a political center, but a spiritual home for all Israel. David gathered 30,000 chosen men for this sacred mission. With songs and celebration, they placed the Ark on a new cart pulled by oxen and began the journey to Jerusalem. The procession moved with joy. Musicians played harps and lyres, singers lifted their voices in praise, and David himself danced with all his might. But near the threshing floor of Nacon, the oxen stumbled. When Uzzah, one of those guiding the cart, reached out to steady the Ark, he was struck dead instantly. The celebration stopped. David was both afraid and angry, afraid of God's power and angry that his good intentions had led to tragedy. The Ark was taken to the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite, where it remained for 3 months. During this time, God blessed Obed-Edom's household abundantly. When David heard this, he realized his mistake. The Ark was meant to be carried on poles by the Levites, as God had instructed Moses. The good intention wasn't enough. The proper reverence mattered too. David tried again, this time following the ancient instructions carefully. The Levites purified themselves and carried the Ark on their shoulders using the poles. Every 6 steps, they stopped to sacrifice oxen and fatted calves. David, dressed in a linen ephod like the priests, danced before the Ark with unrestrained joy. As the Ark entered Jerusalem, the whole city erupted in celebration. Trumpets sounded, people shouted, and David whirled in dance. Only Michal, Saul's daughter and David's wife, watched with scorn from her window, feeling his behavior was beneath royal dignity. But David would not let pride dampen his joy, declaring he would become even more undignified in praising God. The Ark was placed in a special tent David had prepared in the city of David. There he offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before the Lord. Then David blessed the people in the name of the Lord and distributed food to every household in Israel, bread, meat, and sweet cakes, ensuring all could share in the celebration. This moment marked Jerusalem's transformation into the spiritual center of Israel. David appointed Levites to minister before the Ark continuously, with songs of thanksgiving and praise. The sounds of worship rose day and night from the city heights, drawing pilgrims from every tribe to pray and offer sacrifices. Yet even as the Ark rested in its tent, David felt troubled. He lived in a palace of cedar, while the Ark of God dwelled in a tent of cloth. Surely, he thought, God deserved a more permanent dwelling. This desire would plant the seed for the great temple his son would eventually build. The Covenant, God's promise to David. That night, David spoke with Nathan the prophet about his desire to build a house for God. Nathan initially encouraged the king, but God had other plans. Later that night, God gave Nathan a message for David that would echo through the centuries and shape the destiny of Israel. "Go and tell my servant David," God said, "when your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever." This divine promise, known as the Davidic covenant, went far beyond anything David could have imagined. God was not interested in a house of cedar and stone. Instead, he promised to build David a house, a dynasty that would never end. Even more remarkable, God promised to be a father to David's son and to never withdraw his love as he had from Saul. David went before the ark and sat in God's presence, overwhelmed by this unexpected blessing. "Who am I, O sovereign Lord, and what is my family that you have brought me this far?" he prayed. With humble gratitude, he accepted that though he would not build God's temple, his son would, and his line would continue forever. This covenant transformed David's understanding of his role. He was not just a king, but a link in God's unfolding plan for his people. The promise that David's descendant would always sit on the throne became the foundation of Israel's hope, even in the darkest times to come. Later prophets would see in this promise the coming of a greater king, the Messiah, who would bring eternal peace. For now, David focused on governing his kingdom with justice and mercy. He established the royal court with both military and civilian officials. He appointed judges throughout the land and created a system where even the poorest Israelite could seek justice. His reputation for fairness drew people from distant tribes to bring their disputes before him. David also reformed the religious practices of Israel. He organized the Levites and priests into divisions that would serve in rotation. He appointed musicians and gatekeepers for the tabernacle. Working with the prophets, Nathan and Gad, he established proper forms of worship that combined the ancient traditions with new psalms and prayers. Under David's guidance, Israel began to develop a rich cultural life centered on worship. The king himself wrote many psalms, songs that express the full range of human emotion before God, from deepest despair to highest joy. These psalms became the heart of Israel's worship and continue to comfort and inspire believers to this day. As Jerusalem grew in beauty and importance, pilgrims from every tribe made their way to the city of David. There, they found not just the seat of government, but a place where heaven and earth seemed to meet. The sounds of worship rose day and night from the hill of Zion as singers and musicians offered continual praise to the God who had chosen David and blessed Israel. In all these undertakings, David never forgot the source of his authority. "The Lord is my shepherd," he wrote in one of his most beloved psalms. Even as king of a powerful nation, he saw himself as a sheep under God's care and a shepherd to God's people. The conquests, expanding the kingdom. With Israel united and Jerusalem established as both political and religious center, David turned his attention to securing his kingdom against external threats. The Philistines, hearing that David now ruled all Israel, gathered their forces to attack before his power could grow further. David met them in the valley of Rephaim, seeking God's guidance before battle. With divine blessing, he defeated the Philistines so decisively that they abandoned their idols on the battlefield. When they regrouped and attacked again, David waited for God's specific instructions. The Lord told him to circle behind the enemy and attack when he heard the sound of marching in the tops of the balsam trees, a sign that divine forces moved before him. Following these victories, David systematically addressed the threats surrounding Israel. To the south, he subdued the Amalekites, who had long raided Israelite settlements. To the east, he defeated the Moabites, who became tributary to Israel. To the north, he conquered the Arameans of Damascus when they came to help Hadadezer, king of Zobah. Each victory expanded Israel's borders and influence. The Bible records that the Lord gave David victory wherever he went. Gold, silver, and bronze from these conquests would later contribute to the temple treasury. More importantly, these campaigns secured peace for Israel after generations of border raids and invasions. Unlike many conquerors of his time, David often showed restraint in victory. When he defeated Moab, he allowed much of their population to live, though under tribute. When he conquered Edom, he stationed garrisons throughout the land, but did not destroy their cities. This balanced approach to warfare, firm but not cruel, distinguished David from many ancient rulers. Perhaps David's greatest military achievement came against the Ammonites. When David sent representatives to offer condolences to King Hanun on his father's death, the young king humiliated them by shaving half their beards and cutting off their garments. This grave insult demanded a response. The Ammonites, realizing their danger, hired Aramean mercenaries to help them. Facing this combined threat, David sent Joab with Israel's finest warriors. Joab divided his forces, leading one group against the Arameans, while his brother Abishai faced the Ammonites. "Be strong and let us fight bravely for our people and the cities of our God," Joab told his brother. "The Lord will do what is good in his sight." The strategy worked perfectly. The Arameans fled before Joab, and seeing this, the Ammonites retreated into their city. Later, when the Arameans regrouped with reinforcements from beyond the Euphrates, David himself led a larger force against them. The victory was so complete that the Aramean kingdoms became David's vassals, afraid to help the Ammonites again. Through these campaigns, David created a mini-empire that controlled the major trade routes between Egypt, Arabia, and Mesopotamia. Tribute flowed into Jerusalem from subjected peoples, while trade flourished along roads now safe from bandits and hostile forces. Israel, once a minor nation struggling to survive among powerful neighbors, had become a regional power. Yet, with this expansion came new challenges. David needed to govern these conquered territories and maintain garrisons in distant lands. He appointed administrators and tax collectors throughout the kingdom. The simple shepherd king now ruled a complex state requiring careful management and diplomacy. Throughout these years of conquest, David never forgot that his success came from God. After each victory, he dedicated portions of the spoils to the Lord. He consulted with prophets before campaigns and gave thanks after victories. Even as his power grew, he remained at heart the shepherd boy who trusted in a power greater than his own. Bathsheba, the sin and the consequences. As David's kingdom flourished, his name grew mighty throughout the lands. His armies conquered territories far and wide, expanding Israel's borders beyond what anyone had imagined possible. The days were long and sweet with victory, and the nights brought rest to all but the king himself. It happened one evening, as the cool breeze swept through Jerusalem, that David rose from his bed and walked along the roof of the palace. The city lay peaceful below him, houses bathed in moonlight, streets empty as citizens slumbered. From this height, his gaze fell upon a woman bathing on a nearby rooftop. Her beauty caught his breath, skin glowing in the silvery light, dark hair cascading like shadows. "Who is this woman?" David asks the servant later, his voice barely hiding the desire that had taken root within him. "That is Bathsheba, daughter of Eliam, wife of Uriah the Hittite," came the reply. Uriah, one of David's mighty men, a loyal soldier currently fighting with Joab against the Ammonites at Rabbah. The knowledge should have stopped David's yearning, but power often blinds those who wield it. Though warned of her marriage, David sent messengers to bring her to him. Bathsheba came as summoned, for who could refuse the king? Under the weight of royal attention, she entered the palace. The scripture records simply that David lay with her, words that conceal the gravity of what transpired that night. A king taking what was not his to take. A married woman in the bed of someone not her husband. Days passed and a message reached David: "I am with child." 3 words carrying implications that threatened to unravel all he had built. The king who had conquered nations now faced a battle within his own heart, a war between desire and righteousness, between concealing his sin and owning it. David chose concealment. He summoned Uriah home from battle under the guise of seeking news from the front. Uriah arrived, dust from the road still clinging to his sandals, eyes bright with loyalty. "Go down to your house," David urged after their meeting, sending him away with a gift. "Rest with your wife." But Uriah did not go home. When morning came, word reached David that Uriah had slept at the palace entrance with the king's servants. "Why did you not go to your house?" David questioned, confusion in his voice. Uriah's answer cut deeper than any sword could have. "The ark and Israel and Judah dwell in tents, and my lord Joab and your servants are camping in the open field. Shall I then go to my house to eat and drink and lie with my wife? As you live, I will not do this thing." Such honor from the man he had wronged stung David's conscience. Yet rather than confess, he pushed deeper into darkness. He invited Uriah to eat and drink with him, pouring wine until Uriah was drunk, hoping to overcome the soldier's resolve. Still, Uriah did not return home. With paths to concealment closing, David wrote a letter to Joab sealed with royal authority. "Set Uriah in the forefront of the hardest fighting, and then draw back from him, that he may be struck down and die." With cruel irony, he handed this death sentence to Uriah himself to deliver. Uriah returned to battle carrying his own execution order. Joab, following his king's command, placed Uriah where the fighting was fiercest. When the city's defenders made a sortie, Uriah the Hittite fell among others, a valiant death hiding a terrible truth. Word came to David: Uriah the Hittite is dead. Tell Joab not to be troubled, David replied coolly. The sword devours one as well as another. When her mourning period ended, David took Bathsheba as his wife, and she bore him a son. To the kingdom, it appeared the king had shown mercy to a widow. Only David knew the weight of deception crushing his spirit. Yet even as he believed his sin hidden from human eyes, other eyes had seen. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. Nathan's rebuke, the prophet and the king. Months passed as David lived with his secret. The child grew, Bathsheba settled into palace life, and perhaps the king began to believe that time would bury his transgression. But secrets have a way of rising to the surface, especially those that God has seen. The prophet Nathan arrived at the palace one morning, requesting an audience with the king. David welcomed him, unaware that this visit would split his life into before and after. Nathan, whose words had once brought David the promise of an eternal kingdom, now carried a different message. There were two men in a certain city, Nathan began, his voice measured as he wove his tale. One rich and the other poor. The rich man had very many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing but one little ewe lamb. David listened, drawn into the story, as Nathan described how the poor man had raised this lamb like a daughter. It ate from his table, drank from his cup, and slept in his arms, beloved as family, not merely a possession. A traveler came to the rich man, Nathan continued, and he was unwilling to take one from his own flock to prepare for his guest. Instead, he took the poor man's lamb and prepared it for his visitor. Anger flashed across David's face. As the Lord lives, the man who did this deserves to die. He must restore the lamb fourfold because he did this thing and showed no pity. The silence that followed seemed to stretch across eternity. Nathan's eyes locked with David's, and when he spoke again, his words fell like thunder. You are the man. The color drained from David's face as Nathan continued, now speaking with divine authority. Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, I anointed you king over Israel, delivered you from Saul's hand, gave you your master's house and wives, and if that had been too little, I would have given you much more. Why have you despised the word of the Lord, doing evil in his sight? Each word stripped away layers of self-deception as Nathan recounted David's sins without euphemism, taking Bathsheba, killing Uriah by the sword of the Ammonites. The prophet then delivered God's judgment. The sword shall never depart from your house. I will raise up evil against you from within your own household. Unlike Saul before him, who had made excuses when confronted by Samuel, David's heart broke. 3 simple words escaped his lips. I have sinned. Nathan nodded slowly. The Lord has put away your sin, you shall not die. Relief washed over David, but it was short-lived as Nathan added, Nevertheless, because by this deed you have utterly scorned the Lord, the child who is born to you shall die. After Nathan departed, David retreated to his chamber, refusing food, spending nights on the ground in sackcloth. For 7 days he fasted and prayed, begging God to spare the innocent child. On the 7th day, the child died. When servants whispered the news to each other, afraid to tell the king, David noticed their behavior and understood. Rising from the ground, he washed, changed his clothes, and went to the house of the Lord to worship. His servants, bewildered by this response, questioned him. While the child was alive, I fasted and wept, thinking, who knows? The Lord may be gracious to me, and the child may live. But now he is dead. Why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I shall go to him, but he will not return to me. David then went to comfort Bathsheba in her grief. In time, she conceived again and bore another son. They named him Solomon, peaceful, and the Lord loved him. Through Nathan, God gave Solomon another name, Jedediah, meaning beloved of the Lord. Though forgiven, David would carry the consequences of his actions throughout his remaining years. The sword would indeed never leave his house, bringing suffering that even a king's resources could not prevent. Yet in this darkest chapter of David's life shines the light of genuine repentance, a broken and contrite heart that God did not despise. Solomon's birth, in the beginning after the storm of sin and loss, a gentle peace began to settle over David's household. Bathsheba, who had entered the palace through Sorrow's Gate, now found herself mother to a prince with a special destiny. Solomon grew strong and healthy, bringing joy to his parents' hearts with each passing day. Unlike the child born of their sin, Solomon thrived under what seemed a special blessing. His eyes sparkled with intelligence beyond his years. Even as a toddler, he watched the world with quiet intensity, absorbing everything around him. David often found himself wondering what thoughts moved behind those observant eyes. "He will build the temple I was not permitted to build," David confided to Bathsheba one evening as they watched the boy sleeping. "My hands have shed too much blood, but his will create beauty and peace." The prophet Nathan became a frequent visitor to Solomon's chambers, fulfilling God's instruction to mentor the child. Sometimes David would pause outside the room, listening as Nathan taught the boy stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the foundations of their faith. Other times he heard them discussing the natural world, the cedars of Lebanon, the creatures of field and forest, the stars that wheeled overhead. "Your son asks questions I struggle to answer," Nathan admitted to David once. His mind reaches for understanding like most children reach for sweets. Though Solomon held a special place in David's heart, the king was careful not to show favoritism among his children. His household was large, many sons and daughters born to his various wives. Each needed guidance, discipline, and love. Yet David could not help but notice how different Solomon was from his older brothers, particularly Absalom and Amnon. While they seemed drawn to physical prowess and displays of strength, Solomon sought wisdom. Where they competed for attention, Solomon observed. As they grew restless with peace, he flourished in it. Meanwhile, beyond the palace walls, Israel prospered. The wars that had marked the early years of David's reign had largely subsided. Trade routes opened, bringing wealth and new ideas into Jerusalem. The kingdom expanded not just through conquest, but through alliances and diplomatic relations with neighboring lands. David used this peaceful interlude to plan for the temple he would never build. He gathered materials: cedar, gold, silver, bronze, and precious stones, storing them for the day when Solomon would oversee their transformation into a dwelling place for the Ark of the Covenant. "When you build the temple," David told Solomon during one of their walks through the storerooms, "remember that no building, however magnificent, can contain God. The temple will be a symbol, a meeting place between heaven and earth." Solomon nodded, running his small hand over a block of polished marble. "But why must we build it with such expensive materials if God doesn't need them?" David smiled at the wisdom in the question. "We use the best not because God requires luxury, but because offering our finest demonstrates the value we place on our relationship with Him. The temple will reflect the beauty and order of creation itself." As Solomon grew, David began including him in matters of state, allowing him to observe royal judgments and council meetings. The boy absorbed these lessons eagerly, learning the complexities of governance and justice that would serve him well in years to come. Not all was perfect, however. Shadows lingered at the edges of David's kingdom. Nathan's prophecy that the sword would never depart from his house remained a constant worry. The king noticed concerning behaviors developing among his older sons, particularly Amnon, his firstborn, whose eyes sometimes followed his half-sister Tamar in ways that made David uneasy. Joab, ever David's pragmatic general, occasionally suggested that the king should clarify the line of succession to prevent future conflict. "Your sons grow into men with ambitions of their own," he warned. "Without clear direction, they may tear apart what you've built." David acknowledged the wisdom in this counsel, but hesitated to name an heir. Part of him believed that God would make the choice clear in time, just as Samuel had been led to him while he tended sheep. Another part feared that naming a successor might inflame jealousies already simmering below the surface. Instead, he focused on preparing Solomon for whatever role God intended for him. The boy learned not just statecraft and religious observance, but practical skills as well: architecture, music, poetry, and the management of resources. If he was to build the temple one day, he would need to understand both vision and implementation. One evening, as sunset painted Jerusalem's walls with golden light, David took Solomon to the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite, the site he had purchased after the plague that followed his ill-fated census. "Here," David said, pointing to the cleared area, "is where the temple will stand. I saw the angel of the Lord here, sword drawn over Jerusalem. When I built an altar and made sacrifice, the plague stopped. This place marks both judgment and mercy, the perfect foundation for God's house." Solomon stood silent, absorbing both the view and the significance of the location. Then he asked, "Will I be worthy of such a task?" David placed his hands on his son's shoulders. "Worthiness comes not from our perfection, but from God's calling. I was a shepherd boy with blood on my hands, yet God called me a man after his own heart. Your name means peace. Perhaps that is what makes you suitable for this work I cannot do." As they returned to the palace under a sky filling with stars, David felt a sense of hope he had not known since before his fall. Solomon represented not just continuation, but redemption, a chance for David's legacy to transcend his failures. The boy was living proof that even after great sin, God could bring forth new beginnings. The house divided, Amnon and Tamar. While Solomon's star rose quietly in Jerusalem, darkness gathered in another corner of David's household. His firstborn son, Amnon, had grown into a young man of strong passions and weak character. Handsome like his father, but lacking David's depth of spirit, Amnon moved through the palace with entitlement flowing through his veins. It happened that Amnon became infatuated with his half-sister Tamar, daughter of David, through Maacah. Tamar possessed a rare beauty, with gentle eyes and a kind nature that drew people to her. She was known throughout Jerusalem for her modesty and skill in preparing special cakes for religious festivals. Amnon's desire for Tamar consumed him until he grew thin and sickly with wanting what he could not have. His cousin Jonadab, noticing this change, pressed him for answers. "Why are you, the king's son, so haggard morning after morning?" Jonadab asked, concern mixing with curiosity in his voice. Amnon confessed his inappropriate longing. "I love Tamar, my brother Absalom's sister." Rather than counsel restraint, Jonadab devised a scheme that would forever alter the fabric of David's family. "Lie down on your bed and pretend to be ill," he suggested with alarming casualness. "When your father comes to see you, ask him to send Tamar to prepare food for you and feed you with her own hands." The plan worked with tragic precision. David, concerned for his firstborn's health, sent word to Tamar, "Go to your brother Amnon's house and prepare food for him." Tamar went innocently to help her ailing brother, bringing dough to make cakes in his presence. As she kneaded and shaped the dough, Amnon watched from his bed and the pretense of illness masking his true intentions. When the cakes were ready, he dismissed all his servants, leaving himself alone with Tamar. "Bring the food into my chamber," he commanded, "and feed me with your own hand." Trusting her brother and obeying her father's wishes, Tamar brought the cakes to Amnon's bedside. What happened next shattered the peace of David's house more completely than any external enemy could have. Amnon seized her wrist and pulled her toward him. "Come, lie with me, my sister," he demanded, his voice thick with desire. Horror filled Tamar's face as she realized his intentions. "No, my brother," she pleaded, trying to reason with him. "Do not force me, for such a thing is not done in Israel. Do not do this disgraceful thing." She continued with wisdom beyond her years. "Where could I carry my shame, and you would be counted among the fools in Israel? Please, speak to the king, for he will not withhold me from you." Her words, likely a desperate attempt to escape immediate danger rather than a genuine belief that such a marriage could be allowed, fell on deaf ears. Amnon, stronger than Tamar and blinded by desire, would not listen to reason or plea. He overpowered her and violated her, taking by force what love and law both forbade. Then came the cruel twist that revealed the true nature of Amnon's feelings. After the assault, his passion turned to revulsion. The scripture states it plainly, "Then Amnon hated her with very great hatred, so that the hatred with which he hated her was greater than the love with which he had loved her." "Get up! Go away!" he ordered, his voice now filled with disgust. Tamar, destroyed by what had happened, replied through tears, "No, my brother, for this wrong in sending me away is greater than the other that you did to me." But Amnon called his servant and commanded, "Put this woman out of my presence and bolt the door after her." So Tamar was thrust outside, the door bolted behind her, her life forever altered. In the custom of the time, she put ashes on her head and tore the ornate robe that marked her as a virgin daughter of the king. With her hand on her head, a sign of unbearable grief, she went away crying bitterly. Her brother Absalom found her in this state. Though he immediately understood what had happened, he counseled silence. "Has Amnon your brother been with you? Be quiet for now, my sister. He is your brother. Do not take this to heart." So Tamar lived desolate in her brother Absalom's house. David, when he heard of all these things, became very angry. Yet the scripture records no action taken against Amnon, no justice for Tamar. Perhaps David, remembering his own sin with Bathsheba, found himself unable to judge his son with appropriate severity. Or perhaps the weight of kingship made him hesitate to punish his heir apparent. Whatever the reason, his inaction would prove costly. Absalom spoke neither good nor bad to Amnon, but beneath his silence, hatred took root and grew. For 2 full years, Absalom waited, saying nothing while his anger hardened into resolve. Patient in his fury, he bided his time until opportunity aligned with vengeance. The moment came when Absalom held a sheep-shearing festival at Baal-hazor near Ephraim. Such celebrations were typically joyous occasions marked by feasting and wine. Absalom invited all the king's sons, then approached David personally. "Your servant has sheep-shearers. Please let the king and his servants go with your servant." David declined the invitation. No, my son, let us not all go, lest we be burdensome to you." Though Absalom pressed him, David would not attend, but gave his blessing. Then Absalom made his true request. "If not, please let my brother Amnon go with us." "Why should he go with you?" David asked, perhaps sensing something amiss in this specific request. But Absalom persisted until David relented, sending not just Amnon, but all his sons to the celebration. With the king's blessing, they departed for what they believed would be days of feasting and brotherhood. None suspected the darkness waiting at the journey's end. Absalom's rebellion, the fall of a son. The sheep-shearing feast at Baal-hazor began like any other celebration. Abundant food, flowing wine, laughter echoing across the hillsides. Amnon and the other princes arrived to find tables laden with delicacies and servants attentive to their every need. Absalom played the perfect host, ensuring his brothers' cups never emptied, encouraging them to eat, drink, and enjoy themselves to the fullest. As the day wore on and the wine took effect, Absalom gave a signal to his servants, instructions prepared long before the first guest arrived. "Mark when Amnon's heart is merry with wine, and when I say to you, 'Strike Amnon,' then kill him. Do not fear. Have I not commanded you? Be courageous and valiant." The moments that followed unfolded with terrible swiftness. As Amnon relaxed, his guard lowered by wine and the false security of family, Absalom's servants fell upon him with swords. Before the other princes could comprehend what was happening, Amnon lay dead among the scattered remains of the feast. Panic erupted. The king's sons fled for their lives, each mounting his mule and racing toward Jerusalem. As they fled, a rumor outpaced them, reaching David with devastating news. Absalom has struck down all the king's sons, and not one of them is left. David tore his garments and lay on the earth, surrounded by servants who did the same. The entire palace plunged into mourning for what seemed a massacre of royal blood. Yet amid the grief, Jonadab, the very cousin who had helped Amnon plot against Tamar, spoke up with surprising insight. "Let not my lord suppose that they have killed all the young men, the king's sons, for Amnon alone is dead. This has been determined by Absalom from the day Amnon violated his sister Tamar." Even as Jonadab spoke, the watchman spotted a crowd approaching on the road from Horonaim. The king's sons appeared, weeping loudly as they entered the palace gates. David rushed to meet them, and they fell into their father's arms, confirming Jonadab's words. Only Amnon had been killed. Meanwhile, Absalom fled to Geshur, to the house of King Talmai, his maternal grandfather. There he remained for 3 years beyond David's reach, but never far from the king's thoughts. David mourned for Amnon until time softened his grief. Gradually, his heart turned toward his absent son, though justice and kingship prevented him from simply welcoming Absalom home. It was Joab who finally intervened, perceiving the king's inner conflict. With characteristic pragmatism, he devised a plan to reconcile father and son. He sent to Tekoa for a wise woman and instructed her to pretend to be a mourner, approaching the king with a fabricated story about her 2 sons, one who had killed the other in a fight and now faced execution himself. The woman pleaded eloquently before David, asking why he would grant mercy in her case but not extend the same grace to his own family. "Why then have you planned such a thing against the people of God? For in giving this decision, the king convicts himself, inasmuch as the king does not bring his banished one home again." David, perceiving Joab's hand in this performance, nevertheless recognized the truth in her words. He summoned Joab and permitted him to bring Absalom back to Jerusalem, but with a condition. Let him return to his own house, but do not let him see my face. So Absalom returned to Jerusalem, but lived 2 full years without seeing his father. During this time, his resentment smoldered and grew. Handsome beyond compare, the scripture notes that from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head there was no blemish in him. Absalom became known throughout Israel for his striking appearance. His hair, which he cut only once a year when it became too heavy, weighed 200 shekels by the king's weight. Eventually, frustrated by his continued exclusion from the king's presence, Absalom sent for Joab to intercede on his behalf. When Joab ignored his summons twice, Absalom ordered his servants to set fire to Joab's barley field. This dramatic action finally gained Joab's attention. "Why have your servants set my field on fire?" Joab demanded when he arrived at Absalom's house. "To bring you here," Absalom replied bluntly. "Why have I come from Geshur? It would be better for me to be there still. Now let me go to the king's presence, and if there is guilt in me, let him put me to death." Joab reported these words to David, who finally summoned Absalom. When his son entered the room, he bowed with his face to the ground. David kissed him, a gesture of reconciliation that should have healed the breach between them. But the kiss came too late to mend Absalom's hardened heart. Having regained his position at court, Absalom began methodically undermining his father's rule. He procured a chariot and horses, along with 50 men to run before him, creating the image of royal authority. Rising early each morning, he would stand beside the road to the city gate where people came seeking judgment. When anyone approached with a dispute, Absalom would call out, "From what city are you?" After hearing their reply, he would say, "See, your claims are good and right, but there is no man designated by the king to hear you." Then would come his masterstroke. "Oh, that I were judge in the land. Then every man with a dispute or cause might come to me, and I would give him justice." When people tried to bow before him, he would take their hand and kiss them, an intimate gesture that won hearts throughout Israel. Through these tactics, Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel over 4 years of patient plotting. When he judged the time right, Absalom approached David with seeming innocence. "Please let me go to Hebron to pay my vow which I made to the Lord while living in Geshur." David, unsuspecting, gave his blessing. "Go in peace." But Absalom's journey to Hebron had nothing to do with vows and everything to do with rebellion. He sent secret messengers throughout the tribes of Israel with instructions. "As soon as you hear the sound of the trumpet, then say, 'Absalom is king in Hebron.'" 200 men from Jerusalem accompanied him, invited as guests and ignorant of his intentions. He also summoned Ahithophel, David's trusted counselor from his city of Gilo. As sacrifices were offered in Hebron, Absalom's conspiracy gained strength, and the people supporting him multiplied. A messenger reached David with alarming news. "The hearts of the men of Israel have gone after Absalom." Recognizing the gravity of the threat, David made an immediate decision. "Arise, and let us flee, or else there will be no escape for us from Absalom. Go quickly, lest he overtake us suddenly and bring disaster upon us." And so the king who had conquered Jerusalem now fled from it, accompanied by his household and loyal servants. They crossed the Kidron Valley and headed toward the wilderness, leaving behind 10 concubines to keep the palace. As they departed, all the country wept aloud. Among those who joined David's exodus was Ittai the Gittite, a foreigner who had arrived in Jerusalem just days before. When David suggested he return to safety, Ittai's response revealed the profound loyalty the king still commanded from some. "As the Lord lives and as my lord the king lives, wherever my lord the king shall be, whether for death or for life, there also will your servant be." The priests Zadok and Abiathar also came, bearing the Ark of the Covenant. But David sent them back to the city with these words: "Return the Ark of God to the city. If I find favor in the eyes of the Lord, he will bring me back and let me see both it and his dwelling place. But if he says, 'I have no pleasure in you,' behold, here I am, let him do to me what seems good to him." As David ascended the Mount of Olives, he went wheat barefoot and with his head covered in grief. Word came that Ahithophel had joined Absalom's conspiracy, news that cut David deeply. for Ahithophel's counsel was so valued it was said to be as if one consulted the word of God. "O Lord," David prayed, "please turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness." As if in immediate answer, Hushai the Archite met David at the summit, clothes torn and dust on his head. David recognized an opportunity and gave Hushai a dangerous mission. "Return to the city and tell Absalom, 'I will be your servant, O king. As I have been your father's servant in the past, so I will be your servant. Thus you may defeat the counsel of Ahithophel for me.'" While David continued toward the wilderness with his remaining loyal followers, Absalom entered Jerusalem in triumph. The city that had celebrated David now welcomed his rebellious son. The kingdom of Israel stood divided, poised on the edge of civil war, with father and son as opposing kings. As night fell over the city, Absalom turned to Ahithophel for counsel on securing his newly stolen throne. The advice he received would fulfill Nathan's prophecy that David's sins would revisit him in the most public way. "Go in to your father's concubines, whom he has left to keep the house. Then all Israel will hear that you have made yourself odious to your father, and the hands of all who are with you will be strengthened." So they pitched a tent on the palace roof, the very place where David had first seen Bathsheba, and there before all Israel, Absalom went into his father's concubines. The son's public sin echoed the father's private one, bringing Nathan's words to terrible fruition. "I will take your wives before your eyes and give them to your neighbor, and he shall lie with your wives in the sight of this son." The Morning King, the death of Absalom. David stood atop the city gate, his eyes fixed on the road. His armies had gone to battle against his son Absalom. Though king, he was first a father. Deal gently with the young man, like he had told his commanders before they left. Now he waited for news. The rebellion had torn the kingdom apart. Absalom, with his handsome face and flowing hair, had stolen the hearts of many in Israel. For years he'd greeted people at the gate, listening to their troubles and saying, "If only I were judge in the land, I would give you justice." Little by little, he turned the people against his father. Then came the day Absalom declared himself king in Hebron. David, hearing of the betrayal, fled Jerusalem with those loyal to him. The king walked barefoot up the Mount of Olives, weeping as he went. "If I find favor in the Lord's eyes," he said, "he will bring me back." The forest of Ephraim became the battlefield where this family tragedy would reach its end. Joab, David's hardened commander, led the royal forces against Absalom's troops. The forest claimed more lives that day than the sword, as Absalom's men became lost and fell in the rough terrain. Absalom himself rode through the woods on his mule. His magnificent hair, which he cut only once a year when it grew too heavy, became his downfall. Passing under a great oak, his head caught in the branches. The mule continued on, leaving him hanging helplessly between heaven and earth. A soldier found him and reported to Joab, who asked, "Why didn't you strike him to the ground?" The man replied, "Even if I felt 1,000 silver shekels in my hand, I would not harm the king's son." But Joab had no such restraint. Taking 3 javelins, he went and thrust them into Absalom's heart. They threw Absalom's body into a pit in the forest and piled stones over it. The prince who had built himself a monument in the king's valley to preserve his name now lay under a heap of stones, far from home. A watchman on Jerusalem's wall spotted a runner approaching. Soon after, he saw another. "The running of the first is like the running of Ahimaaz," he told David. The king said, "He is a good man and comes with good news." Ahimaaz called out, "All is well." He bowed before David and blessed God for delivering them from the rebels. But when David asked, "Is the young man Absalom safe?" Ahimaaz hesitated, saying only that he saw a commotion but knew nothing certain. Then came the Cushite messenger. Again, David asked his only question, "Is the young man Absalom safe?" The Cushite answered, "May the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up to harm you be like that young man." In that moment, David the king vanished. Only David the father remained. Shaking, he went up to his chamber over the gate. As he went, he wept, crying out, "O my son Absalom, my son Absalom! If only I had died instead of you! O Absalom, my son, my son!" The victory turned to mourning throughout the camp as word spread of the king's grief. Soldiers who had risked their lives slipped back into the city ashamed, like men who had fled in battle rather than won it. Joab came to David in anger. Today you have humiliated all your men who saved your life and the lives of your family. You love those who hate you and hate those who love you. You have made it clear today that the commanders and their men mean nothing to you." His harsh words cut through David's grief. The king composed himself and sat at the city gate, meeting with his people. But in his heart, the wound of Absalom's death would never fully heal. In the quiet dark of night, David often remembered his son's face, his proud walk, his clever words. Had he failed as a father? Could he have shown more guidance, more discipline, more love? These questions haunted him through sleepless nights. The tale of Absalom became a warning whispered through generations of pride, betrayal, and the terrible cost of divided loyalties. But for David, it remained simply the story of a beloved son lost too soon and a father's endless grief. Restoration and regret, rebuilding the kingdom. The kingdom lay wounded, much like its king. David returned to Jerusalem with mixed feelings, relief at victory, sorrow for its cost. Towns and villages greeted him with uncertain loyalty. Some had backed Absalom, others had remained faithful. Now all waited to see how the king would respond. David chose mercy over vengeance. "Today I am king again in Israel," he proclaimed, extending pardons to many who had turned against him. This gentle approach helped stitch the torn fabric of the nation back together, thread by careful thread. The journey back to Jerusalem became symbolic of healing. At the Jordan River, Shimei, who had cursed David during his flight, came trembling to meet him. Falling at David's feet, he begged forgiveness. Though Abishai urged David to execute the man, the king refused. "Shall anyone be put to death in Israel today? Do I not know that today I am king over Israel?" Mephibosheth, Saul's lame grandson whom David had cared for, also came. During the rebellion, David believed he had been disloyal. Now Mephibosheth appeared with uncut beard and unwashed clothes, signs of mourning since David's departure. "My servant deceived me," he explained. "I wanted to go with you, my king." David welcomed him back into his household, but remained cautious. The betrayals had left him wary, even of old friends. Trust, once broken, returned slowly, like spring after a harsh winter. Barzillai, an elderly Gileadite who had provided for David during the rebellion, received special honor. David invited him to Jerusalem to live in the palace. "I am now 80 years old," Barzillai replied. "Can I tell the difference between what is pleasant and what is not? Can your servant taste what he eats and drinks? Can I still hear the voices of men and women singers? Why should your servant be an added burden to my lord the king?" His humble refusal touched David deeply. Instead, Barzillai sent his son Kimham to serve in the royal court. In this simple exchange lay a lesson. Loyalty expects no reward beyond the joy of giving itself freely. The northern tribes quarreled with Judah over who had more right to the king. David belonged to Judah, but all Israel claimed him. These tensions simmered beneath the surface of the reunited kingdom like hidden embers. Then came Sheba, son of Bichri, a Benjamite who seized upon this discord. Blowing a trumpet, he called out, "We have no share in David, no part in Jesse's son, every man to his tent, Israel." The northern tribes followed him in yet another rebellion. David commanded Amasa, his new commander, to gather Judah's men and pursue Sheba. When Amasa took longer than expected, David sent Abishai with the royal guard. Joab, still smarting from his dismissal as commander, joined his brother. When they met Amasa on the road, Joab greeted him warmly, then, grasping his beard as if to kiss him, thrust a dagger into his rival's stomach. Stepping over Amasa's body, Joab continued the pursuit of Sheba without a backward glance. The rebels took refuge in Abel Beth Maacah, a northern town. Joab's men began building a siege ramp against the wall when a wise woman called from the city. "I am one of the peaceful and faithful in Israel," she said. "Why destroy what belongs to the Lord?" Joab explained they only wanted Sheba. Understanding the threat to her city, the woman told the townspeople, who threw Sheba's head over the wall. The rebellion ended and Joab returned to Jerusalem. David watched these events with growing weariness. Each conflict seemed to echo previous ones. The same ambitions, the same betrayals, the same blood. The cycle of violence that had defined his life continued unbroken. Still, in quiet moments, David found solace in his harp and psalms. The shepherd boy still lived within the aging king, and in song he poured out both his struggles and his faith. "The Lord is my rock, my fortress, and my deliverer," he sang. My God is my rock, in whom I take refuge. As Jerusalem rebuilt its walls and spirits, David reflected on all he had gained and lost in his long journey from Bethlehem's fields to Israel's throne. Wisdom had come at great cost, etched by sorrow into his heart. The kingdom was restored, but regret remained his constant companion. The census, the fatal choice. Rain had not fallen for months. The land lay parched under a merciless sun, crops withered in the fields, and livestock grew thin. People looked to their king for answers, but David's mind had turned toward counting his strength rather than seeking God's mercy. "Go and count Israel and Judah," David commanded Joab. "I want to know how many fighting men we have." Something in the king's tone made Joab uneasy. This was not about defense or planning. Pride had taken root in David's heart. "My lord the king, may the Lord multiply the troops 100 times over," Joab protested. "But why does my lord want to do such a thing?" David's face hardened, and Joab knew further argument was useless. The king's word prevailed against Joab and the commanders. For 9 months and 20 days, officials traveled throughout the land, recording names in village after village. They crossed the Jordan, moved through Gilead, past Dan, around to Sidon, through the Hivite and Canaanite towns, and into the Negev of Judah. When the count was complete, Israel had 800,000 fighting men, and Judah 500,000. David received these numbers with initial satisfaction, but by nightfall his conscience troubled him deeply. "I have sinned greatly in what I have done," he confessed. "Now, Lord, take away the guilt of your servant. I have acted very foolishly." The census itself was not wrong. God had commanded counts before. But David's motive revealed a heart momentarily trusting in human strength rather than divine protection. Morning brought the prophet Gad to David's door. "This is what the Lord says. I am giving you 3 options. Choose one of them for me to carry out against you." The choices lay heavy before the king. 3 years of famine, 3 months of fleeing from enemies, or 3 days of plague. David's shoulders slumped. "I am in deep distress," he said. "Let us fall into the Lord's hands, for his mercy is great, but do not let me fall into human hands." He chose the plague, placing his fate directly in God's judgment rather than human cruelty. The sickness swept through Israel like wildfire. People fell in the streets, in fields, in homes. From Dan to Beersheba, 70,000 died. As the destroying angel reached Jerusalem and stretched out his hand toward the city, the Lord relented from the destruction. "Enough!" God commanded. The angel stood at the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite, his sword still drawn but now still. David looked up and saw the angel between heaven and earth. Falling face down, he cried, "I have sinned, I have done wrong. These are but sheep. What have they done? Let your hand fall on me and my family." Gad came to David again, instructing him to build an altar on Araunah's threshing floor. David went immediately. Seeing the king approach, Araunah bowed down and asked, "Why has my lord the king come to his servant?" "To buy your threshing floor," David explained, "so I can build an altar to the Lord, that the plague on the people may be stopped." "Take it," Araunah offered. "Here are oxen for the burnt offering, and threshing sledges and ox yokes for the wood." But David insisted on paying. "I will not offer to the Lord my God burnt offerings that cost me nothing." For 50 shekels of silver, David bought the threshing floor and the oxen. He built an altar there and offered sacrifices. The Lord answered with fire from heaven, consuming the offerings. The plague stopped. This threshing floor on Mount Moriah, where Abraham had once prepared to sacrifice Isaac, where now David had made atonement, would later become the site of Solomon's temple, a place of potential death transformed into a center of worship. In the aftermath, David walked through Jerusalem's streets, seeing the empty homes and grieving families. No military victory or royal decree could undo this damage. His census had brought only loss. The greatest dangers, David realized, often come not from enemies but from our own hearts. This lesson, paid for in countless lives, would stay with him until his final breath. Even kings remain accountable to a higher throne. The Gibeonites, a debt of blood. 3 years of drought gripped the land. Fields cracked under the relentless sun, wells dried to dust, and hungry eyes turned toward the palace. David sought the Lord's face about this prolonged suffering. "It is on account of Saul and his blood-stained house," came the answer. "It is because he put the Gibeonites to death." David's brow furrowed as he recalled this nearly forgotten chapter of history. The Gibeonites were not Israelites, but remnants of the Amorites. In Joshua's time, they had tricked Israel into making a peace treaty with them. Though gained by deception, this oath was binding. The Gibeonites had lived as water carriers and woodcutters among the Israelites for generations, but Saul, in his misguided zeal for Israel, had tried to annihilate them, breaking the ancient covenant. Now, years later, this unpaid debt had brought God's judgment on the land. David summoned the Gibeonite elders. "What shall I do for you?" he asked. "How can I make atonement so that you will bless the Lord's inheritance?" His question acknowledged both their grievance and their right to seek justice. "We have no right to demand silver or gold from Saul or his family," they replied, "nor do we have the right to put anyone in Israel to death." Their restraint impressed David, who pressed further. "What do you want me to do for you?" "As for the man who destroyed us and plotted against us, so that we have been decimated and have no place anywhere in Israel, let 7 of his male descendants be given to us to be killed and their bodies exposed before the Lord at Gibeah of Saul." David agreed, though the request troubled him deeply. He protected Mephibosheth, Jonathan's son, because of his oath to his friend. But he took 2 sons of Rizpah, Saul's concubine, and 5 sons of Merab, Saul's daughter. The 7 men were put to death together during the barley harvest. Rizpah, mother of 2 of the victims, took sackcloth and spread it on a rock. From the beginning of harvest until the autumn rains, she guarded the bodies day and night, keeping the birds away by day and the wild animals by night. When David heard of Rizpah's vigil, this mother's love stronger than death itself, something broke within him. The cycle of violence that had defined so much of his reign suddenly appeared in its true, terrible light. He sent for the bones of Saul and Jonathan from the men of Jabesh Gilead, who had rescued them after the Philistines had hung their bodies on the wall of Beth-shan. David brought these remains, along with the bones of those who had been killed, and buried them properly in the tomb of Saul's father, Kish. After this, God answered prayer for the land. Rain fell at last upon the parched earth. Fields renewed their promise of harvest, and wells filled again with sweet water. The drought had ended, but its lessons remained. This episode revealed an important truth. Unaddressed wrongs do not disappear with time. They burrow deeper, affecting even those who had no part in the original sin. Justice delayed is still justice demanded. For David, it also highlighted the complex moral calculations of leadership. Sometimes healing requires revisiting painful history. Sometimes peace comes only after confronting what everyone preferred to forget. In quiet moments afterward, David thought often of Rizpah on her rock, steadfast, grieving, dignified. Her love for her sons had outlasted everything: Saul's dynasty, political expedience, even death itself. In her devotion, David glimpsed something of God's own relentless love, fierce, protective, unwavering. The rains that ended the drought nourished more than crops. They watered a deeper understanding in David of covenant, justice, and mercy, qualities that would mark his final years as king. David's mighty men, the warriors of legend. Around evening fires throughout Israel, storytellers spoke of David's mighty men, warriors whose deeds had passed into legend. Each tale grew with the telling, yet at their core lay truths about courage, loyalty, and the bonds formed in battle. Foremost among them stood the 3, Josheb-Basshebeth, Eleazar son of Dodai, and Shammah son of Ag. Their exploits had become the measure against which all other warriors were judged. Josheb, chief of the 3, once raised his spear against 800 men in a single encounter. The fight lasted until his arm grew so tired that his hand froze to his sword. When others fled, he stood his ground, and the Lord brought victory. Eleazar, son of Dodai, faced the Philistines at Pas-dammim when the Israelite army retreated. He took his stand in a barley field and struck down enemies until he could hardly lift his arm. The troops returned only to strip the dead. That day, the Lord won a great victory through one man's courage. Shammah defended a field of lentils when others fled from Philistine raiders. Standing at the center of the field, he struck down the enemy and saved the harvest. Through him, the Lord secured another victory. Once during the harvest, when David hid in the cave of Adullam with Philistine forces occupying Bethlehem, he mentioned his thirst. "Oh, for water from the well near the gate of Bethlehem," he sighed, remembering his hometown. 3 mighty men broke through enemy lines, drew water from the well, and carried it back to David. When they presented it to him, David was overwhelmed by their devotion. He could not drink what had been purchased with such risk. "Far be it from me, Lord, to drink this," he said, pouring it out as an offering. "Is it not the blood of men who went at the risk of their lives?" Beyond the 3 were the 30, elite warriors hand-selected by David. Abishai, Joab's brother, led them. Though he never matched the fame of the 3, he once raised his spear against 300 men and overcame them. Benaiah, son of Jehoiada from Kabzeel, performed great exploits. He struck down 2 of Moab's best men and descended into a pit on a snowy day to kill a lion. He also struck down an impressive Egyptian who carried a spear. Although the Egyptian was armed, Benaiah confronted him with only a club, wrested the spear from his hand, and killed him with his own weapon. The list continued, men from towns and villages across Israel and beyond. Uriah the Hittite appeared among them, a reminder of David's great sin. Eliam, son of Ahithophel, was there too, Bathsheba's father, who later joined Absalom's rebellion. These men had followed David through wilderness and warfare, loyalty tested in fire and blood. Some had been with him since his days fleeing from Saul, hiding in caves and forests. Others joined later, drawn by his growing reputation and divine blessing. David remembered each face, each voice. He recalled shared meals around low fires, whispered plans before dawn raids, the gleam of starlight on drawn swords. These men had become his brothers, closer than family. Now, as David grew older, many of them were gone. Some had fallen in battle, others to illness or age. The survivors bore scars, both visible and hidden. Their youthful strength had faded, replaced by something perhaps more valuable, wisdom earned through survival. In his private moments, David sometimes wondered if their legendary status brought comfort to those who had sacrificed so much. Did tales told by firelight ease the pain of missing limbs? Did songs of their bravery warm cold winter nights when old wounds ached? The bonds between warriors transcend ordinary friendship. Men who have faced death together share something profound and unspoken. David understood this truth better than most. Though king, he remained forever connected to these men who had risked everything for him and for Israel. As the kingdom enjoyed rare peace, David ensured his mighty men received honor, land, and position. Their children found places in his court, their families protection under his rule. It was the least he could offer those who had given so much. The chronicles of David's mighty men remind us that great achievements rarely belong to one person alone. Behind every legendary leader stand those whose names history may forget, but whose courage makes all victory possible. Solomon's rise, the dawn of a new era. As David grew old, his body could no longer keep warm even under layers of blankets. His servants found a young woman named Abishag to care for him, though he had no intimate relations with her. While David's strength faded, his mind remained sharp as he prepared for the kingdom's future. In those days, Adonijah, David's 4th son, saw his father's weakness and declared himself king without permission. Handsome and proud like his brother Absalom before him, he gathered chariots, horsemen, and 50 men to run before him in royal procession. Neither David nor the loyal priests had approved this succession, yet Adonijah hosted a great feast by the stone of Zoheleth, inviting all his brothers except Solomon. The prophet Nathan, sensing danger, went to Bathsheba with urgent news about Adonijah's plot. "Have you heard that Adonijah has made himself king without David's knowledge? Let me give you advice to save your life and your son Solomon's life. Go to King David and remind him of his oath that Solomon would rule after him." Bathsheba approached David's bedchamber, where Abishag tended to him. She bowed low and asked, "My lord, didn't you swear that Solomon would sit on your throne? Yet Adonijah has become king without your approval." While she spoke, Nathan arrived as planned, confirming her words and asking David directly, "Have you decided that Adonijah will reign after you?" David's eyes flickered with the old fire that had made him both warrior and king. He called for Bathsheba and renewed his promise. "As surely as the Lord lives, who has delivered me from every trouble, Solomon your son shall be king after me." With newfound strength, David summoned Zadok the priest, Nathan the prophet, and Benaiah his military commander. "Take my servants with you," David instructed them. "Place Solomon on my own mule and bring him to Gihon Spring. There, anoint him king over Israel, blow the trumpet, and shout, 'Long live King Solomon!' Then follow him back to sit on my throne, for he will be king in my place." The procession moved through Jerusalem streets as Solomon rode his father's mule, a symbol no one could mistake. At Gihon, Zadok took the horn of oil from the sacred tent and poured it over Solomon's head. Trumpets sounded while the people shouted, "Long live King Solomon!" They played flutes and rejoiced so loudly the ground seemed to shake. The news reached Adonijah during his feast. His guests scattered in fear when they heard what David had done. Adonijah, fearing Solomon's judgment, fled to the altar and grasped its horns, a plea for sanctuary. When Solomon learned of this, he showed mercy. If he proves himself worthy, not a hair of his head will fall to the ground, but if evil is found in him, he will die. With Solomon established on Israel's throne, David prepared his final instructions. He called Solomon to his side, his voice now softer but still commanding respect. "I'm about to go the way of all earth. Be strong and show yourself a man. Keep the charge of the Lord your God, walk in his ways, keep his statutes and commandments as written in the law of Moses." David reminded Solomon of specific matters needing attention after his death: rewards for those who had shown loyalty, justice for those who had betrayed him. Most importantly, he shared his vision for the temple that Solomon would build. "The Lord has given peace all around. Now you shall build a house for his name." The mantle of leadership passed from father to son. The shepherd boy who became king now entrusted his legacy to the son of promise. Dawn broke over Jerusalem, not just a new day, but a new era for Israel. David's last words, a king's farewell. The royal court gathered around David's bed as he offered his final message. His voice, though weakened by age, carried the weight of experience that only decades of triumph and failure can provide. These weren't merely the words of a dying king, but the distilled wisdom of a life lived fully before God. "The Spirit of the Lord speaks through me, his word rests on my tongue. The God of Israel has spoken, the Rock of Israel has said to me, when one rules justly over men, ruling in the fear of God, he dawns on them like the morning light, like the sun shining forth on a cloudless morning." David's eyes grew distant, remembering his humble beginnings among the sheep pastures of Bethlehem. "Is not my house right with God? Has he not made with me an everlasting covenant, arranged and secured in every part? Will he not bring to fruition my salvation and grant me my every desire?" He turned to Solomon, fixing his gaze on the young king. "If you walk before me faithfully as your father David has done, and do what is right, I will establish your royal throne over Israel forever, as I promised David your father when I said, 'You shall never fail to have a successor on the throne of Israel.'" Beyond spiritual matters, David gave practical advice about leadership. Learn who is trustworthy and who seeks only their own gain. Be decisive but patient, strong yet compassionate. The hardest task of leadership is knowing when to act swiftly and when to wait for the Lord's timing. Having guided Israel from a loose confederation of tribes to a unified kingdom, David understood the fragility of national unity. Remember that you rule 12 tribes, not one. Each has its pride and history. A wise king listens to all but favors none above others. David instructed Solomon regarding the temple's construction, explaining, "All this I have in writing from the hand of the Lord upon me, and he gave me understanding in all the details of the plan." He had prepared materials in abundance: gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and precious stones. He had organized the priests and Levites into divisions for temple service. "Though I desired to build a house for the Lord's name, God told me, 'You shall not build a house for my name because you have been a warrior and have shed blood.' Instead, this honor would belong to Solomon, whose name derived from shalom, meaning peace." David then gathered all Israel's officials to publicly transfer authority to Solomon. "Now devote your heart and soul to seeking the Lord your God. Begin building the sanctuary of the Lord God, so that you may bring the Ark of the Covenant and the sacred articles into the temple." The elderly king raised himself from his bed and addressed the assembled leaders. "My son Solomon is young and inexperienced, and the task is great because this palace is not for man but for the Lord God. With all my resources I have provided for the temple: gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, onyx, turquoise, stones of various colors and marble, all in great quantities." Then David asked, Who will offer willingly to the Lord today?" The officials responded generously, donating personal treasures for the temple. David blessed the Lord before the assembly, acknowledging that everything comes from God's hand. The people feasted and rejoiced as Solomon was anointed king a second time, establishing his reign firmly before all Israel. As David's strength ebbed, he whispered final private words to Solomon, drawing on his lifetime of both triumph and regret. "Remember that true wisdom begins with fear of the Lord. I have failed him at times, yet his mercy endures. Learn from my mistakes as much as my victories." The room grew quiet as David's breathing became labored. His last thoughts drifted to the psalms he had composed throughout his life, words that would comfort God's people long after his bones had turned to dust. The death of David, the end of an era. After reigning 40 years, 7 in Hebron and 33 in Jerusalem, David's life journey reached its conclusion. He died full of years, having experienced wealth, honor, and a legacy few would ever match. They buried him in the city of David, the fortress he had captured decades earlier when his reign had just begun. Solomon mourned his father deeply, yet found strength in knowing he had received David's blessing and guidance. The transition of power occurred without the bloodshed that often accompanied royal successions in neighboring kingdoms. This peaceful transfer fulfilled David's final wish, that his son would begin his reign in an atmosphere of stability. The people of Israel grieved their fallen king, remembering how he had led them from weakness to strength. Under David, Israel had expanded its borders, defeated surrounding enemies, and risen to prominence among nations. More than a military leader, David had united the 12 tribes into a cohesive nation with Jerusalem as its spiritual and political center. During the period of national mourning, stories of David's exploits spread throughout the land. People recalled his courage against Goliath, his generosity toward Mephibosheth, his passionate worship before the ark, and even his moments of failure, followed by genuine repentance. No king had ever connected with his people on such a personal level. Priests and Levites honored David's memory with music and psalms, the same songs he had written during his years as both shepherd and sovereign. The sweet singer of Israel's voice was now silent, but his words continued to echo through the hills and valleys of the Promised Land. In Bethlehem, elderly residents still remembered the ruddy-cheeked boy who had once tended his father's sheep. How far he had journeyed from those humble beginnings. Some recalled Samuel's mysterious visit decades earlier, now understanding the significance of that ancient prophet's actions when he anointed the youngest son of Jesse. Solomon faced the daunting task of following such a legendary figure. Yet he also inherited David's capable advisors, battle-tested army, and established administrative systems. Most importantly, he possessed his father's wisdom, passed down through years of mentorship. Among neighboring kingdoms, news of David's death prompted calculation and concern. Would his successor maintain Israel's military dominance? Some considered testing the new king's resolve, not realizing that Solomon's wisdom would prove as formidable as his father's courage. Perhaps most significant was the unfulfilled dream that now passed to Solomon, building the temple. David had purchased the threshing floor of Araunah, the Jebusite, gathered materials, and drawn up plans. The groundwork was laid. Construction could now begin. What David had conceived in his heart, Solomon would build with his hands. In the quiet of the royal chambers, Solomon often reflected on his father's complex legacy. David had been warrior and poet, sinner and saint, passionate lover of God, yet sometimes flawed in his humanity. This multifaceted nature made David not just a towering historical figure, but a deeply human one. Someone whose struggles and triumphs would resonate with people through centuries to come. The kingdom David left behind stood at the peak of its power and influence. From the Brook of Egypt to the Euphrates River, nations either belonged to Israel or paid tribute to its king. Trade flourished, bringing wealth into royal coffers. The administrative districts David had established ensured efficient governance. As the official mourning period ended, life gradually returned to normal. Fields needed planting, businesses resumed operation, and the daily rhythms of existence continued. Yet something fundamental had changed. The transition from founding monarch to established dynasty had occurred. What David had built would now be tested by time. Tapper legacy and myth, the eternal king. 3 generations after David's death, the kingdom he built had already divided. The northern tribes broke away, leaving only Judah and Benjamin under the rule of David's descendants. Yet despite this fracturing of the nation, David's influence never diminished. His name became the standard by which all future kings were measured. Throughout Israel's turbulent history, prophets would speak of good kings as walking in the ways of David, while wicked rulers were condemned for departing from his example. When hope faltered during national crises, the memory of David's reign represented Israel's golden age, a time of unity, strength, and divine favor. More than a historical figure, David gradually took on mythic proportions in the national consciousness. Stories of his exploits grew in the telling, passing from parents to children across generations. The shepherd boy who slew a giant with a stone became a powerful metaphor for Israel itself, the small nation that could triumph against overwhelming odds through faith and courage. The Psalms attributed to David preserved not just his words, but the intimate portrait of his relationship with God. In these sacred poems, people found David's fear and faith, his questions and certainties, his doubt and devotion. Unlike other ancient rulers who portrayed themselves as flawless, David's writings revealed his mistakes and regrets alongside his triumphs. "Out of the depths I cry to you, O Lord," he wrote in one psalm, capturing the universal human experience of desperation. In another, he declared, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," expressing perfect trust. This vulnerability and honesty created a connection that crossed boundaries of time and circumstance. Beyond Israel's borders, neighboring nations remembered David as the warrior king who had subdued them. The Philistines, once Israel's most fearsome enemy, never regained their former power after David's victories. Moab, Ammon, and Edom all paid tribute to Jerusalem because of territories David had conquered. His military achievements transformed the region's political landscape for centuries. But perhaps David's most lasting impact came through the prophetic promises connected to his lineage. The Lord had sworn, "Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever." This covenant created an expectation that shaped Israel's future hope, that David's greatest son would someday restore everything that had been lost. As centuries passed and foreign powers dominated the land, Babylon, Persia, Greece, and finally Rome, the hope for a new Davidic king grew stronger. This wasn't merely political nostalgia, but profound spiritual expectation. Prophets spoke of a coming ruler from David's line who would establish justice and peace, not just for Israel, but for all nations. Isaiah proclaimed, "A shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse. From his roots, a branch will bear fruit." Jeremiah declared, "The days are coming when I will raise up for David a righteous branch, a king who will reign wisely." Ezekiel promised, "My servant David will be king over them, and they will all have one shepherd." These prophecies transformed David from a historical figure into a symbol of future redemption. The term Son of David became more than a genealogical marker. It represented divine appointment, messianic expectation, and national renewal. People looked for one who would embody David's courage and faith while fulfilling God's ultimate purposes. In the centuries after David's death, his physical city expanded beyond the original fortress he had captured. Jerusalem itself became synonymous with his name, the City of David. Its walls and buildings might change, but its spiritual significance remained tied to the shepherd king who had made it Israel's capital and brought the Ark of the Covenant to rest there. David's tomb became a pilgrimage site, visited by those seeking connection with Israel's glorious past. Kings and commoners alike would stand before the burial place, reflecting on David's extraordinary journey from obscurity to eternity. Some came seeking inspiration. Others brought prayers and petitions, believing David's favor with God somehow extended beyond death. The Lessons of David, Reflections for the Modern World. As night settles around us and our story draws to a close, let's reflect on what David's life might teach us as we lie in the peaceful darkness. This ancient king, separated from us by 3,000 years, still speaks through his actions, writings, and the impact he left on the world. Perhaps the most striking aspect of David's story is how thoroughly human he was. Unlike legendary heroes of mythology, David never appears as a demigod or perfect being. We see his fears and doubts, his passion and weaknesses, his triumphs and tragic mistakes. This authenticity makes his life accessible to us across the centuries. When David faced Goliath in the Valley of Elah, he demonstrated courage not because he felt no fear, but because he acted despite his fear. His confidence came not from self-assurance, but from experience with God's faithfulness in his life. "The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine," he declared. True courage always connects personal action with trust in something beyond ourselves. From David's years running from Saul, we learn about patience and respect for proper timing. Though anointed as future king, David refused to take matters into his own hands. Twice he spared Saul's life when he could easily have claimed the throne through violence. Some opportunities, though tempting, may not align with our deeper values or long-term calling. Wisdom knows when to wait. The friendship between David and Jonathan teaches us about loyalty that transcends self-interest. Jonathan, as Saul's son, might naturally have seen David as a rival. Instead, he protected David even when it meant surrendering his own claim to the throne. Their covenant reminds us that true friendship sometimes requires significant sacrifice. David's dance before the ark reveals the importance of uninhibited worship. When his wife Michal criticized his public display, David replied that he would become even more undignified than this. Genuine expression of joy and devotion sometimes means setting aside concern for how others might judge us. The dark episode with Bathsheba and Uriah stands as a sobering reminder that power can corrupt even the noblest heart. David's abuse of authority led to adultery, deception, and ultimately murder. Yet when confronted by Nathan the prophet, David's response shows the path back from moral failure. Immediate acknowledgement of wrongdoing without excuses or blame shifting. In Psalm 51, written after this incident, David pleads, "Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me." This prayer acknowledges that true restoration requires internal transformation, not merely changed behavior. The humility to recognize our need for renewal forms the foundation for genuine growth. David's relationship with his children reflects the challenges of balancing public duties with family responsibilities. His passive response to Amnon's assault on Tamar and his initial indulgence of Absalom's pride both contributed to later family tragedy. Even those who succeed in professional life may struggle with the intimate complexities of family dynamics. The census David ordered late in his reign demonstrates how even experienced leaders can make serious misjudgments. His decision brought plague upon the nation. Yet David's response shows accountability. "I have sinned greatly in what I have done. Now, Lord, take away the guilt of your servant. I have done a very foolish thing." Beyond these personal lessons, David's kingdom offers insights about leadership and governance. He built systems that outlasted him, organized efficient administration, and created infrastructure for stable transition of power. Great leaders think beyond their own lifetime, establishing foundations for future generations. David's creation of temple worship protocols, with musicians, gatekeepers, and priests arranged in orderly divisions, shows the value of thoughtful organizational systems. His appointment of judges throughout the land established justice as central to national identity. These structures served Israel long after David himself was gone. As sleep begins to claim your consciousness, consider how David's life reminds us that greatness and weakness often coexist in the same person. His story invites us to embrace our full humanity, with all its potential and limitations, while remaining open to divine guidance and grace. None of us is perfect, yet, like David, we might still accomplish meaningful things if we pursue our deepest values with courage and persistence. The shepherd boy who became king never forgot where he came from. Even at the height of his power, David maintained a fundamental humility before God, asking in wonder, "Who am I, O Lord God, and what is my family that you have brought me this far?" This perspective, seeing our achievements as gifts rather than purely personal accomplishments, brings both gratitude and responsibility. As your thoughts drift toward dreams, remember that David's greatest legacy wasn't the buildings he constructed or battles he won, but the hearts he touched through his vulnerabilities and victories. His psalms continue comforting troubled souls thousands of years later because they express universal human experiences with authentic emotion and enduring hope.